All right, good evening, everyone. This is Athens-Clarke County Mayor Kelly Gertz, and I'm here with the County Commission for a special called session and a work session here on Thursday, January 14th, 2021. I'm going to ask Clerk Spratland to call the roll for us so we may begin.
Davenport.
Here.
Parker. Blake.
Here.
Wright.
Present.
Jensen. Poole.
Present.
Edwards.
Here.
Myers.
Here.
Thornton.
She is present.
Okay. Hamby.
Here.
We have a quorum.
All right, thank you, Madam Clerk. I appreciate it. All right, everyone, we have two items of new business to consider after suspension of rules. And so I do need a motion for suspension of rules.
So moved.
I'll second.
All right, I have a motion from Commissioner Edwards and a second from Commissioner Link for suspension of rules. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed, please indicate. All right, motion carries. All right, and our first order of business is consideration of the Community Development Block Grant CV or COVID funds. And this is our first of what is anticipated to be two allocations of federal grant funds. I'll go ahead and ask Manager Williams just to briefly describe this tranche of funds that we've received from the federal government and their use so that the public has that benefit.
Thank you, Mayor. So back in April of last year, when Congress passed the CARES Act, there were some community development block grant funds that were allocated across the nation. And at the time, we learned that $829,000 was allocated to Athens-Clarke County. There was a rush to do that, and then it took a while for the Housing and Urban Development Department to catch up, HUD. And we didn't really learn until August clear guidance on how best to spend those funds. At that point, just in those few short months, there was a lot of different, there was a second CARES Act allocation through the state. And about the time that we learned of the CDBG guidance, the commission had voted to distribute some $6 million or so in CARES Act funding that we were able to get reimbursed from the federal government. All that to say, the school district was coming in. What we decided to do with the influx of money from other sources was to go ahead and have this $800,000 go through our normal CDBG application process, which started in October and culminated with applications being submitted in December, along with our regular round CDBG. So for this $800,000, the Vision Committee has recently met and has recommended 4 agencies for funding. And for the folks that are watching, this is different from the local funds to the resiliency package. These federal funds can actually be provided to nonprofits to give direct relief. And of the 4 applications that are being recommended for your approval, they're all direct relief in the forms of rent, mortgage assistance. And so that is the recommendation that's for you tonight. There's some additional CDBG funding that will we talked about at the work session that perhaps might go to homeless assistance with regards to the pandemic, but there's more conversation to come on that. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Manager Williams. I appreciate it. Any interest in discussion of this item? I'm going to recognize Commissioner Link.
Yeah, I have a quick question. I know the other night you mentioned that additional funding going towards a staff member within the local government. Is that correct?
So thank you, Commissioner Link. So what I'd ask Housing Community Development Director Banerjee to do is talk about that second tranche of funding that you're not approving tonight. We were just trying to give you a sense of how it all might be spent. And so she was telegraphing that in the forthcoming, cycles, we'll come back to you with some recommendations on how to spend that funding. What you're approving tonight does not approve that position. It is to award these funds to these 4 nonprofits.
Okay. So will we be having a work session regarding the homelessness crisis? I know that we were scheduled for one last March and it was put off when COVID hit, and we've not had that rescheduled, and the crisis has gotten I'd say exponentially worse in light of the pandemic. Will we have an actual work session in which we can, that will include some of our nonprofit providers and folks who are doing the work on the ground, so we can hear from them as to what specifically the situation and the needs are?
Yes, I think there's an intermediate step the mayor and I have discussed, and that is at the forthcoming retreat that he has recently scheduled. This is homelessness is such a huge problem, and what I find us in the rhythm of coming up with an intervention here and an intervention there. And to your point, Commissioner Link, I'm not sure that we're coordinating well with everybody, even though I will say I don't want to sell anything short, because there is good collaboration going on between agencies, particularly with the pandemic. I say all that to say what the mayor and I have talked about is at the upcoming retreat, for the 4 priority areas that you've laid out, and homelessness is one of them, that we actually engage in a little bit of problem deconstruction. I'm getting feedback from somebody. Where we can talk about where it is that you want the government to best intervene.
Will that include the on-the-ground providers? I really want to hear from the folks who are actually doing the work, not just our staff.
Well, at the retreat, we weren't intending to invite outside providers, and staff's not necessarily going to present to you. We want to engage you and learn more about the complexity of the problem, the causes of the problem, your own knowledge here locally, what is driving these issues. And that will help us, instead of jumping straight to the how we're going to fix it, it's what are we fixing? And then we're going to walk out of there with what we can convey to these third-party partners and engage in conversation.
And among the things that I asked for on Tuesday was sort of an ecosystem understanding. I think one of the things that we would benefit from enormously, and the public would too, is sort of knowing who does what currently, and so that way we can have something of a gap analysis to know sort of what would be the next steps, and how this prospective but not yet approved position in housing and community development would fit in. Commissioner Link, you're muted.
Sorry. I'm not comfortable having that conversation without having heard first from the folks who are doing the work on the ground. I'm not qualified to, say what specifically the issues are and what the solutions are. I feel like, it would be a pretty fruitless conversation until we've been given real details from the folks who are actually doing the work. And I've had, a handful of conversations here and there with some of these folks, and I have more scheduled, but I feel like it should be conversations that happen among this whole group before we even begin to, have discussions amongst ourselves.
I think we can certainly garner some of that information from those providers, to make sure that we know what their experiences are, kind of what they are seeing. Certainly among other things, I want to see really early on, those folks talk about just what the effect this pandemic has had on the ground service delivery, and obviously that filter is part of what led us to this allocation of funds. And the homelessness component obviously is not what we're approving tonight. So we've got lots of opportunity for discussions.
What is the obstacle to having these folks present to this commission directly before we have that retreat discussion or any discussion amongst ourselves?
Well, we would have to certainly schedule some time for that. Obviously, we are in an environment where we're doing an enormous amount of work. There are a couple of dozen agencies in Athens-Clarke County that provide some level of homeless service. So we would have to figure out how to coordinate and sequence that, and how to make meaning of it. Again, one opportunity we have is to understand, what we might call that continuum of care. and then follow that up with some of the individual dialogue with those agencies.
And I would say, I'm sorry, Mayor.
No decision is planned for the next 3 weeks.
Kelly, can I add something here?
Yeah.
I agree with Melissa, but for tonight's purposes, can I go ahead and make a motion that we approve the CDBG money that's on the table, and work towards what Melissa's talking about? Go ahead and make that motion to approve the recommendations of the CDBG tonight.
I'll second that.
Any further input? Commissioner Houle.
Yeah, just for the benefit of the public, I know we talked about this at the work session, but it was very late by the time we got to it. So Manager Williams, could you just kind of clarify how the 4 organizations that are getting this funding were selected when there were about a dozen or so people applying?
Yes, there were 14 applications totaling about 1.4 million, Commissioner Houle. And we went through our regular process where there was public notice. There were meetings that were held. Applications were taken in, and they were screened by the Vision Committee, which is a group of residents that are appointed by this body to work alongside staff and to evaluate the numerous applications. And it's unfortunate because there's only so many funds. But the top 4 were consistent with both the Vision Committee's recommendations and staff recommendations. So there's been a process to vet this with multiple people involved. Thanks for the opportunity to share that.
Mr. Myers? Go ahead, Jesse. I'm sorry.
And would it be fair to say that capacity to move the funds quickly was a major consideration? I remember that being part of what I heard being explained on Tuesday. Was that kind of what the Vision Committee saw as like what put these folks above the rest?
Well, there are numerous things numerous variables that were considered. I will say one of the things that makes CDBG tough when we for smaller nonprofits is because it's pretty much a reimbursement-based program. So you have to spend the money and then submit the reimbursement request to get it. And from a cash flow perspective for small nonprofits, that can be a high wall to climb.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Carol.
Actually, I wanted to follow up and just thank the Vision Committee for their work. I happened to meet with one of the neighborhood leaders the other day from my side of town is on the Vision Committee, and I was really impressed with the thoughtfulness of that decision-making. I got a hold of the minutes, and I think those are really helpful to look at to see some of the issues that they saw with some of the other funding or understanding why they didn't rank them. I just like to note for the public that these were the top 4 recommendations from the Vision Committee. And the Vision Committee is made up of a very activist group of people who are very involved on the street in the community. So I was very impressed by that. And I did want to say something. I'm trying to find it here to the public that to reiterate, because I'm kind of new to this as well, that in particular that these funds have to be spent on COVID-related activities. I don't have the exact words in there. And when I was looking through the minutes, and this might address some of Jesse's thoughts as well, sometimes the Vision Committee was pointing out that these were broader issues. The applications addressed broader issues, probably some of the ones that Commissioner Link and we will be talking about if we focus in on this at upcoming session. But anyway, I thought the Vision Committee did a really good job, and I appreciate their work here, and I'll be supporting this.
Any others? All right, so there's a motion on the floor from Commissioner Hamby and a second from Commissioner Link. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? All right, hearing none, motion carries. Thanks, everyone. And
Mayor, if I might, Commissioner Link, I heard you loud and clear, and Commissioner Hamby. And HCD does work very closely with the Homeless Coalition, and we can certainly begin. I mean, the conversation's been ongoing, y'all. It doesn't start tonight or stop tonight or start the next time we get together. And certainly their input will be something we can begin to cultivate. And beyond just problem deconstruction, y'all, it's identifying a process by which we move forward to get some real answers and coordination on homelessness. So it's not exclusionary at all. We've heard you loud and clear. It's one of your top 4 priorities going forward, and we just want to continue the conversation. So
I just have a quick question. Why was that homelessness work session canceled and never rescheduled? I mean, I know that things got crazy when the pandemic hit, but it's been nearly a year now. That was to be a public work session. I believe it's really important that we have this conversation publicly, because I'm telling you, not a week goes by when I don't hear from some member of the public who either has been impacted directly by homelessness themselves or has run-ins with homeless folks on their property in their neighborhood. I believe this, our discussions moving forward need to be in the public.
agreed.
We are.
Thank you.
All right, we are moving on to the next item on our agenda, which is a resolution authorizing settlement of litigation. I've asked if Attorney Drake could give us a little bit of background and give the public a little bit of background, this body having previously discussed this matter in executive session. Go ahead, Attorney Drake.
This resolution authorizes the settlement of litigation that was filed on or about October 21st, 2020 by Mr. Salvador Salazar in the State Court of Athens-Clarke County, Georgia, against Officer Roger Williams, a police officer, Athens-Clarke County, Georgia, and Tory Teets, a police officer, Athens-Clarke County, Georgia. This lawsuit arises out of alleged unlawful arrest and unlawful use of deadly force against Mr. Salazar on or about October 6, 2019. The attorneys for the plaintiff and our attorneys have been able to negotiate a resolution of this litigation. The resolution of this litigation, the negotiation of this settlement also involved the insurance carrier for the Unified Government of Athens-Clarke County, and they are in support of and recommend this settlement as well. The commission is not admitting liability or fault, neither are the officers. However, the resolution of this litigation is deemed in the best interest of the Unified Government as a means of managing the risk involved in this action and avoiding unnecessary expense. This would approve and authorize the payment of the sum. The commission will be approving and authorizing the payment of the sum of $250,000 to settle this litigation, and this settlement would also encompass a full and complete settlement of any and all damages the plaintiff may have, Mr. Salazar, as well as would include the payment of his attorney's fees.
Thank you, Attorney Drake. I appreciate it. All right, any commissioners, please indicate if you'd like to provide some comment. I see Commissioner Edwards and Commissioner Wright.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I move to approve this settlement in light of the recommendation from our insurance carrier. If we decide to go it alone, we could be on the hook for a lot more funds out of the general fund. So I move to approve.
I second.
I've got a motion from Commissioner Edwards on the floor with a second from Commissioner Myers. Commissioner Wright.
I wanted to second, but that's okay as long as it's getting done. I did also want to thank the hard work of those who got us to this point, and that Mr. Salazar is asking for this and is happy with the settlement. I just wanted to make sure that the people knew that that was an agreed upon resolution.
Thanks, Commissioner. Commissioner Houle, and then back to Commissioner Myers.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of clarify a couple things, again, for the benefit of the public, because we've gotten to talk about this before now in executive sessions. So, Attorney Drake, could you just clarify, Mr. Salazar has been in the hospital essentially since this incident in 2019, and largely the cost here is to help pay for medical expenses. Is that correct?
Teddy, here comes Sadie.
The ultimately I do anticipate that some of he has been in long-term care since the date of this incident, and to my knowledge is still in long-term care. So you're correct. This settlement will help to cover his future medical costs, and we won't be privy. We will make sure the release covers us as far as any more responsibility for his medical. His attorneys may negotiate further with the medical care providers on how they will pay that. So I don't want to make any incorrect statements regarding that, but certainly I would assume part of this will be used to pay for medical expenses.
Okay. And the incident in question that kind of this emanates from is a fairly well-known one in the community, which was that incident between an officer and a man who was armed with a machete. Is that correct?
That
so
is
people
correct.
kind of know what we're talking about.
That's correct.
I'm in support of this settlement. So I want to be clear about that. I also want to welcome Commissioner Edwards to the Hat Club, along with Commissioner Wright and I. But I do think that this settlement points to not only the human costs, but also the economic costs of us needing to revisit conversations around public safety. I understand the work session tonight is going to be more limited in scope than I think some of us were anticipating. So I do hope that we can incorporate discussion around incidents like this in a future work session very soon. And with that, I'll spare you all any more comment right now.
Any further discussion? Commissioner Myers.
I should have put this in when I put the second in, but this is really for the public as well, because it's something I didn't really understand until just recently as a new commissioner, that the legal costs and the settlement costs for this are paid for by our liability insurance company, less $100,000 deductible that we're required to pay. And we do have a risk management division fund that this comes from that we set aside money for. So I just wanted to make sure that people were aware of that as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner. All right, we have a motion on the floor from Commissioner Edwards and a second from Commissioner Myers. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Please indicate. All right, hearing none, motion carries. All right, thank you, Attorney Drake. And Attorney Drake, this does not require an ordinance, is that correct?
No, Mr. Mayor, just a resolution, and that's what you voted to approve.
Perfect. All right. This concludes our special called session. I'd entertain a motion to adjourn the special called session so we can enter our work session.
So moved.
Second.
I've got a motion from Commissioner Wright and a second from Commissioner Edwards to adjourn the special called session. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, we stand adjourned. All right, we're going to go ahead and move into our work session where we have a single item tonight. I think Manager Williams is going to provide some context and talk a little bit about next steps and kind of where we anticipate being upon conclusion. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the manager.
Thank you, Mayor. And I appreciate y'all agreeing to another meeting tonight. Tuesday night ran long, and this is definitely an issue that I think many of you have wanted to talk about for some time, and certainly given events across the nation, it's something that deserves some time. And therefore, we didn't want to tack it on to an already 5.5 hour long meeting the other night. So thanks for being here tonight. I have Captain Harrison Daniel and Chief Cleveland Sproul with us tonight. I know there were some expectations about what we were going to talk about. I will tell you that I don't think anybody would expect us to cover the topic of use of force in one meeting and be done. So this is an introductory conversation. My understanding, as I shared with you earlier today, this really got prompted by the contract, the pending agenda item about combining our body camera contract and our Taser contract with the same vendor into one, which would provide about $400,000 of savings, which begged the question by this body about the use of Tasers and how does that fit in the bigger scheme of the use of force, policies and practice. And, as pointed out, I think it was back in the November agenda setting session, Commissioner Thornton suggested that we have a work session and talk about that. And the mayor asked me to get that on the books. And this was the first time after the holidays to really dig in. So it is for your benefit and for the viewing public's benefit. It is a a discussion on use of force in general. It does address tasers more specifically because of the agenda item, and talks about transparency and accountability as well. Captain Daniel will take us through that. We are fully expectant that there will be questions that arise tonight that we will need to, give you thoughtful responses to, and we stand ready to come back as soon as the next work session to have a follow-on work session if necessary to further discuss your concerns and questions. So, Mayor, that's what we'd like to attempt to do this evening, and we'll see how the discussion goes, and hopefully we can get some direction on the contracts issue, but certainly inform an ongoing discussion about policing and the use of force. So, Captain Daniel, well, Chief Sproul, do you have anything before we turn it over to Captain Daniel?
Very, very quickly, Manager Williams, and thank you, Mayor Gertz and Commission for allowing us this opportunity. I'm very excited about the opportunity to share this information with you. I want to be respectful of time, so Captain Daniels is going to take you through his presentation. There's a lot of information packed into this presentation, but we will be available to try to answer any questions at the conclusion of his presentation. With that said, I'll step out of the way and I'll turn it over to Captain Daniels to let him take us through his presentation. Captain Daniels.
Thank you, Chief Sproul. Thank you, Manager Williams and Commission and Mayor Gertz. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to each of you tonight. And kind of while I'm starting and introducing myself, I'm going to start sharing my screen. Hopefully everybody will be able to see the presentation here shortly. But again, like Manager Williams said and Chief Sproul said, my name is Harrison Daniel. I'm a captain with Athens-Clarke County Police Department. I've been here for a little over 16 years as a police officer, 17 if you include my internship. And I've served in a variety of capacities. I'm currently over our standards, records, and training. Like it was mentioned a few minutes ago, I'm going to be presenting on the Taser today. And real quick, can somebody let me know, can y'all see my presentation? I'll make sure it's working.
Yeah, we've got the web page up with the transparency and policing slide.
That's what y'all are seeing right now?
Yeah.
All right. Okay, how's that?
And that's the first slide of the presentation now.
Perfect. All right, to get us started, like was mentioned earlier, the purpose of our presentation today and the task that I was asked to do is to provide additional information and answer questions for you, Mayor and Commission, concerning use of force and how it's related specifically to the Taser, how that fits into use of force encounters for our officers on a day-to-day basis. As we do that, what I'm going to do briefly is I'd like to introduce just a quick overview of use of force, what it is from a conceptual standpoint, and then really dive a little bit deeper into the Taser specifically and how that tool and that option in use of force, how it fits into the bigger picture, what we know about it, what we're learning about it, and then talk a little bit more details about how it works and what the purpose is of the Taser. And then I'd also like to talk about accountability and oversight processes that we have in place, specifically concerning the Taser itself, one, but also a little bit more broadly about use of force. And then I do want to introduce a little bit about transparency in policing and how we view that in Athens-Clarke County Police Department, because that's extremely important to us. And that's part of why we're here tonight, is we want to be transparent with what we do and how we do it. And in doing that, we're looking for feedback from you and the community. So as we get started, I just put it in context. When you look at our community and our department in 2019 specifically, when you compare it to the number of citizen contacts that we reported, that means an incident where one of our officers has had some type of contact with a citizen or a visitor within our community. We see that the number of uses of force that occurred within that same time frame is extremely small. It's a very small percentage. It's somewhere in the range of 0.03%. It's an extremely small number. And so what this does tell us is that overwhelmingly, most of our citizen encounters end without any type of use of force. And we consider all of those a success. But inevitably, some do result in a use of force incident. And when they do, we take that very seriously, which is why, as we get into our presentation, we put a lot of time and research and thought into how we implement policies, what types of tools we use, the type of training we go through. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. So as we seek to understand a little bit more from a very high level to, about use of force conceptually, there's a few introductory things to keep in mind. First and foremost is really just thinking about why do we use force and why does that end up happening sometimes. Primarily, it's a response to resistance. And so what happens is there sometimes reaches a point where force may be necessary to overcome resistance in order to achieve a lawful objective, for example, for an arrest, if somebody decides to flee or to physically obstruct a lawful arrest. And the primary purpose when we do use force is not to harm, it's not to hurt, or it's not to punish. But what our goal is to bring the situation under control and to stop the threat as quickly as possible and as safely as possible. And that's for all parties involved. That includes the individual who the force is actually used against, the officer who uses the force, and any other citizens or bystanders who may be in the area. What we also know is that anytime force is used or that type of situation arises, it's a dynamic and it's a rapidly evolving situation. These incidents are not static and they're not a single moment in time that can be dissected in slow motion. They happen very quickly and they happen in the blink of an eye. And because of that, there's a variety of responses that can occur very quickly, and officers are required to make a split-second decision. But what we do know is that the more tools we give to officers, the more options we create for them in those moments, the more options they have to choose from to achieve that objective, which is to safely bring a situation under control and stop the threat. And that includes not just the physical tools or implements such as the taser like we're talking about tonight, but that also includes de-escalation strategies. And really that's our first go-to when it comes to our tools for navigating a use of force incident. But we also know that there's no perfect tool. There's no single tool for every incident. And we may not always have a perfect outcome. And because of that, like we're going to talk about in a minute, we put a lot of time into training and practicing and learning so that we can minimize the mistakes that may occur or the risks that are present anytime force is being used. And lastly, one thing that we have to think about when we're talking about use of force is the distinction between evaluating it against law and policy, which is what we're obligated to do. There's 30 plus years of legal precedents set through the courts all the way up to the Supreme Court that sets the standard for how use of force is applied and how it's judged after the fact. And then all of the factors must be weighed from a totality of the facts and circumstances before judgment's rendered about either the legal or the policy aspect. And so that's very critical when we're understanding use of force. But what we also know is we want to look beyond that. And even when use of force incident is deemed lawful and within our policy limitations, we're still looking to make improvements because we do want to reduce the likelihood that that incident occurs again, even if it was deemed lawful. What's most critical from our standpoint when we're looking at use of force is creating options. And the more options we have, like I mentioned a minute ago, the more opportunity we have to create a safe outcome. And what we know is that options, the risks and limitations are inextricably linked in a use of force incident. And so every action we take carries risks. Every tool we use or every action we take carries limitations to it as well, whether it's how close you are to somebody or how far away you are, what type of injuries may occur based on your actions. And this is extremely critical to us because when we look at this, our mindset is that the more options we can create, the greater opportunity we have to overlap and overcome some of the risks and limitations of each individual device or strategy or technique or tactic that we might apply in a given situation. And so what we're really hoping to do by implementing a tool such as the Taser or any other tool or strategy that we use such as de-escalation, we're trying to give ourselves as many options as possible. And just real quick to touch briefly on law, like I mentioned a second ago, I want to give these to you. These are a couple of cases that were handled at the Supreme Court that set really the standard for us in use of force in law enforcement and have for more than 30 years now. And specifically, Tennessee v. Garner set the Fourth Amendment standard for deadly force. And we have Georgia statute that follows suit with that and is compliant with that. And then Graham v. Connor, the Supreme Court took a look at a lower level of force and then applied the Fourth Amendment to that and really started to dissect some of the standards that we use to evaluate force, whether that is soft hands or empty hand control techniques, the Taser, and some other intermediate tools, and all the way up to lethal force. They set the standards. And what we're doing is we're looking at a totality of facts and circumstances when we do look at force and whether it was justified or not. But again, like I mentioned, even when it's justified, we recognize that potentially a human being has been hurt or harmed in these situations, and that we still want to try to implement strategies and other ways to prevent that in the future. And that's part of why our department, we believe and we feel that we really lead the way, especially across Georgia, especially in particular, like I said, our first strategy, which is de-escalation. It should really be noted that we have used de-escalation and trained on de-escalation for many years. And we have a lot of agencies from across the state that don't get the same training that you're looking at now that every officer in our department receives. And they send their personnel here to learn from us and to learn what we're teaching our officers. But they do that in a limited capacity. Every officer in our department is receiving this type of training. So for example, the fair and impartial policing, we're teaching our officers right at the beginning of their career here at our department how to understand implicit bias and how that may impact their decision making, whether it's stopping a vehicle or how they write a report, or whether it's how they use force. And we're teaching them these things at the very beginning of their career. Every officer gets crisis intervention team training, and that's where they're learning to understand and recognize and then how to interact with individuals who are in crisis and do so in a safe manner that minimizes the likelihood that those situations result in an incident of force. And more recently, Chief Spruill brought the ICAT training, integrating communications assessments and tactics. And that particularly focuses in on how we handle a person in crisis who's also armed with either a blunt object weapon or a bladed weapon, and how we really try to integrate all these things between communications and tactics and other things to avoid putting ourselves in a position where we may have to use deadly force specifically. And we're looking for other options. And then also, inevitably, if force is necessary in an incident, we are training our officers regularly and routinely on how to safely and properly apply specific techniques, how to use the tools that they're given so that they're able to do so effectively and safely. I can't go without saying that nationally, there's been a big conversation about criminal justice reform. A lot of that relates to how police officers and police departments use force. One particular slogan or movement is the 8 Can't Wait. And, they put up 8 particular reforms that they believe are absolutely necessary. And, well, we think that these are really good conversations. And what's really critical, I think, to understand is that our department has addressed these in some way, shape, or form, and we have policies and procedures in place that address each one of these reform issues. And we have been doing so for quite a while, actually. And for example, banning chokeholds and strangleholds. We have prohibited that within our policy for the better part of 2 decades. And unless lethal force would be authorized. Shooting at moving vehicles, again, we've had limitations and prohibitions around that in our policy for the better part of 2 decades. And so we've put a lot of these things into place before this criminal justice reform movement kind of resurfaced nationally back in the summer. And so we really do think, and we would like to say that we believe we are ahead of the curve in a lot of these issues. But we know that we're not perfect, and we can always improve. And so we're always open to more conversations related to this. And that brings us to the Taser. That's what I was asked to really bring to you tonight and discuss how it relates to use of force. And I want to reemphasize that we see the Taser as a tool that creates an additional option for officers in use of force, and that options give them additional opportunities to safely resolve an incident with minimal harm or no harm, and to do so quickly and effectively. So Taser reports out publicly that over 4.5 million field uses have occurred involving the Taser. It's one of the most highly studied, criticized, and evaluated tools in law enforcement. But a big portion of these studies have ultimately concluded that though there are some risks, that it is a safe and effective tool for policing. We're going to get into one study in a minute that suggests that 99.75% of Taser uses result in either no injuries or only minor injuries. And we'll talk about why that's important in just a minute. I think Taser is continually improving and updating their products and trying to better their products so that it's more effective and more safe at the same time. So at our department, we use currently the X26P model. That is what's issued to our police officers. Again, it's an intermediate tool. It's a less lethal tool, and the way it works is it fires 2 probes that have electrical pulses, and the purpose of the electricity from this device is to cause neuromuscular incapacitation. And what that means is that it causes the large skeletal muscular system to essentially kind of lock up and seize, and it restricts the movement of the individual who's under the device, and allows officers an opportunity to safely move in and secure somebody while they're incapacitated. Now, from the device standpoint, what's really important to know is that when you look at the number of amperes that are produced by the device, particularly compared to an average wall socket, it's extremely low. And the reason this is important is because amperes in electricity is what's considered to be the deadly. And so the low amperes is very critical. And the way you can understand this between amperes and voltage is to think of amperes as the volume of water, and voltage to be kind of like the grade or the pitch of the hillside that the water is flowing down. And so, for example, if you have a completely vertical flow of water, but it's a drip, it's not likely to hurt somebody, but it's going straight down the side of a cliff like a waterfall, but it's a small drip. And so it lands on your head, and a drop of water is not likely to harm you. When you compare to a slow moving river, that's an extremely large volume of water, you can very easily get caught in that slow current in that great volume, and it can be very dangerous. And so that's the best way to really kind of create an analogy for the difference between amperes and voltage, and why low amperes is extremely important when we're talking about the science of the device. The other thing to factor in with this device is the distance. Compared to some of our other common tools and options, this one does give us greater distance, and from our perspective, distance gives us more time, gives us more opportunity, and helps us create a greater safety boundary between us and the individual involved in the incident. And so that's extremely critical when we're factoring our options in, is how can we maximize distance while still having an effective ability to bring a person under control and then safely place them under arrest and resolve a situation. Now, there's research out there, like I mentioned earlier, what Taser boasts very proudly is this particular study done by Wake Forest University and the Medical Center, and funded by DOJ, where by collecting in a series of cases and then doing a sampling of 1,200 field cases, they determined that 99.75% of the taser uses resulted in either no injury or very minor injury. And then when we look at the chart below on this slide, when we're comparing injuries to the other tools that might be used during a use of force encounter, we can see that based on this study and the information that the injuries that result from the use of a taser are extremely low compared to the others. And really, that's our goal, is to be able to control the situation safely and not actually create long-term injury to anybody when force is necessary. Like I said, safety and physical safety is our primary concern. But secondary to that, we do see that because there's an increased amount of safety and lower injury levels in officers, that there is some correlation to lower workers' compensation claims. And this is one study that does support that out of Houston Police Department. And then they also found in their study as well that they saw a 60% reduction in injuries to the individual who the taser was used on, or individuals overall when force was being used over the course of their study. And so there's some additional benefits as well beyond just the body safety issue. Now, what we do need to acknowledge and point out is that like any tool we use, like any strategy that we take when it comes to resolving a tense situation or a volatile situation, the taser is no different. It's not without risks. There are risks and there are limitations involved with everything that we do, and taser is no different. A couple of the particular risks with the taser that have been highlighted are ventricular fibrillation, which would be causing a disruption of the heart. Now, a lot of the research will suggest that this is really a particular concern under extreme exposure, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means and why that's important in just a moment. There's also some unknowns concerning small children, elderly, the infirm. There's not as much research in that area, so there are risks there. And then you always have potential injury from a fall, because if you do incapacitate somebody's ability to move, they will fall over periodically, and there's potential injury from there. But most of the time, those injuries are relatively minor. When we talk about the ventricular fibrillation, what's important to understand is, again, we'll compare some different devices. 0.36 joules, which is the energy produced by the taser, is dramatically lower than the energy produced by your average defibrillator used to jumpstart somebody's heart. And so from a scientific standpoint, the risk of it causing defibrillation is extremely low when we see those energy outputs. And this is critical to understand, because when you look at some international standards concerning the threshold and safety threshold for ventricular fibrillation, what you see here is the green dots represent where Taser's devices fall in terms of energy output. And so what we see here is that they fall very well below the safety threshold for ventricular fibrillation. And if you know particularly, what we're going to talk about in a minute, the X26 or the X26P falls even closer to that line than where we're trying to move, which would be the Taser 7. They've changed their device, and then it's giving it an even greater margin from that threshold. Now, beyond the technical issues with the device and what Taser has done to help mitigate the risk itself, we recognize that we have additional responsibility in our department to mitigate risk. And we do so in training, policy, and oversight. Those are three primary ways that we take additional steps internally to mitigate risk. Because again, this is for us about resolving situations safely, resolving them quickly, and minimizing the harm to all parties involved. Particularly with training, one of the most critical things that, from my perspective in particular with officer training, is not just how to use the device, but first and foremost, every officer who carries a device in our department is exposed to the Taser. And the reason this is important is because, from our perspective, it gives them a true appreciation for the device and what it does. and what it does to another person. And so we really want them to understand the human aspect of this. And so we want them to know when they use the taser and they make that choice, what they're doing to another person, because it's not insignificant, though we believe it's safe and effective. The use of the taser is not an insignificant thing. And we do recognize that. We want officers to fully appreciate that before they make that decision to use a taser. Now, when it comes to actually implementing and using the device, we train our officers on how to target safe areas of the body and avoid the chest and the heart, the head, and areas that would be deemed more dangerous. And part of this is creating what we call dart to heart distances. We want to increase our dart to heart distance, meaning we want the taser probes and the electrical current to be as far from the heart as possible while still achieving that neuromuscular incapacitation. So we put officers through training to try to improve the likelihood that they will safely apply it when they make that choice. As I mentioned earlier, there are some unknowns concerning particular situations such as infirm, elderly children, et cetera. We have specific policy restrictions in place addressing these issues because they're not necessarily as certain in our minds when it comes to the safety. And so we place specific policy restrictions on the device when it comes to these types of individuals. Additionally, in environmental perspective, we place restrictions in other situations such as heights, areas where there's likelihood of flammability, such as at a gas station or around gas pumps, or over a body of water, or for example, like on a elevated building or on a rooftop or something to that effect. We place restrictions in those areas to limit the likelihood that a taser would be used, except for the most extreme or dire circumstances, so that we're minimizing the likelihood that there could be secondary injury as a result of the taser use. Now, if you think back to our discussion about ventricular fibrillation, this really applies right here. And we made a policy decision when we implemented the device to set an automatic cycle cutoff and to apply that setting to our device so that at 5 seconds, no matter what happens, the taser will deactivate and the electrical current will stop. They don't have to be set up that way. And many agencies actually allow the device, as long as the officer is pulling the trigger, it will continue sending electrical current. But we found that to be too much of a risk. And so what we've done is we've set ours so that at 5 seconds it turns off. And so that in the heat of the moment, even if the officer is unintentionally squeezing the trigger, it will deactivate. And the reason that's critical is because we're trying to reduce the amount of time that the person is under the electrical cycle or the electrical current, so that we're reducing the likelihood that we reach a dangerous level, which would be extreme exposure. And so when we're talking about extreme exposure, we are talking about 45, 60 plus seconds under electrical current. And we're limiting our officers here at 5 seconds when they pull the trigger. Now, if they happen to pull it a second time, it'll do a second 5 second cycle. But we do require that each separate pull of that trigger has to be individually justified. It can't be justified just because the first pull of the trigger didn't have the effect they wanted it to. They have to justify the second pull of the trigger individually. And then moving on beyond policy, beyond training, there are oversight and accountability mechanisms in place. This one in particular is really more about the device and the way it's designed. There's an internal mechanism and data storage within these tasers that logs. It creates a log for every aspect of the taser's use, from the moment the officer activates it to the moment they fire or discharge the weapon, to the moment it's deactivated and turned off, and then everything in between. It records and creates a log to show us not only the exact moment it was turned on, but whether or not the probes connected, whether or not the circuit completed, how long the duration of the cycles were, how many cycles ran, like how many times the trigger was pulled, and it will report all of that out to us so that we can review it from that standpoint, and it allows us to overlay that with the statements from the officer involved or officers involved and ensure that we're receiving accurate information. And so that's from the device standpoint. And then also from the device standpoint too, where we're looking to go with these devices is, as Taser improves its technology, the the opportunity is there where anytime an officer draws their taser and activates it, it will automatically turn on every body camera for every officer within the range of that device. And so even if an officer happens to forget or for some reason unintentionally decided not to turn on their device, as soon as that taser comes on, every body camera will activate. And that way we hope we can capture as much of an event as possible, see every angle possible, so that we can truly assess and understand and hold everybody accountable, hold our officers accountable in that situation where a taser is used. And that's where we're looking to move as we move toward the Taser 7 and newer body cameras and things like that. And then finally, from oversight and accountability internally, we have a process in place to analyze and investigate every use of force incident, and that includes Taser. And so every time an officer either presents their Taser or they actually deploy the Taser, they're required to both report that, and then second, it's investigated by a supervisor. And then that investigation is reported up through the chain of command and reviewed to make sure it was done properly and thoroughly. It gets passed over to our internal affairs apparatus, so it has a secondary review outside the actual chain of command of the officer. And then beyond that, it goes back through training and policy. And so even, like I said earlier, even when we have incidents that are technically, legally, and justified and they're within our policy limits, we may look at it and say, we still didn't like what we saw. We still didn't like what happened, but our policy wasn't able to address that specific incident. And so we have a feedback loop, and then we may change our policy, or we say this is a training issue and we need to change some training so that we get a better outcome next time. And it doesn't necessarily mean the actual use of the device. It may mean, hey, we need to put something else in place for de-escalation purposes based on this incident. And then that feedback loop gets back to the officers. So we're constantly evaluating, we're constantly providing feedback to try to continue improving our process. And then lastly, on the Taser specifically, some additional research to consider. PERF put out a study that showed a 70% reduction in officer injuries as well as a 40% reduction in suspect injuries. And that's what's really important to us, is reducing the likelihood of injuries in the event that we do have to use force. Under Eric Holder, the DOJ also conducted a study, and they found that there was no clear medical evidence that showed a high risk of serious injury or death from the direct effects of the Taser. Out of the American Journal of Public Health, again, there's more research that suggests here their recommendation is that the Taser is actually used at a lower level of force than hands and down around the hands-on force tactics because of its opportunity to reduce injuries compared to when you get into, for example, a hands-on scuffle with an individual, and that they're recommending that it's safer for that reason and should be considered on that level for use of force. And then finally, this particular study found that there was a correlation between actually less restrictive policies, which we have a pretty restrictive policy on Taser, but less restrictive policies and the increased or the decreased likelihood, that officers will be involved in a fatal shooting. And so what they're saying essentially is that the more likely an officer is when they're equipped with a Taser to resort to the use of that Taser, the less likely they are to resort to lethal force or firearm. And that really is critical. And that's the key for us is even if there's minor injuries, if we can save a life, that's extremely important. So again, it really goes back to that link between options and safety. And the more options we have, we believe we can more likely create safer outcomes. So now I want to show a video to y'all, and I want to preface this. This is a shooting in Philadelphia that happened recently. It involves a man with a knife. And the purpose of showing this is not to dissect every aspect of this case or render judgment on anybody in this case. But what it is officers responded to some type of domestic disturbance and were immediately confronted with a man brandishing a knife. And in this particular case, these officers didn't have tasers, and they ultimately shot and killed this man. And I do want to warn y'all, it is a graphic video. Some of you may have seen it. But I want to play.
Can I jump in here for a second?
Sure.
Sorry to interrupt. I just want to raise a concern about this video being shown, this public access television and everything, it does show somebody being killed. I don't personally, I feel like this is a video. I watched this video last night when we got this package, and I don't feel like it's a great thing to show during this presentation, but if I'm alone on that, then we can go forward as y'all plan. But
And if I can I just jump in here and say that this is a video, this is a video that was played. It's a news clip that's been played on TV across the nation. So it's not as if it's something that hasn't already been seen. I think it adds value to the presentation, and I recommend that we be allowed to move forward with showing the presentation. Does anybody else want to weigh in, or we?
Yeah, well, I was going, Chief, I'll defer the mayor to determine the consensus.
This is Commissioner Wright. I appreciate the warning that Commissioner Huell has brought forward, and I think if we want to make explicit warning more than just the caution graphic content. I have not looked at this yet, but if somebody wants to capture more than Commissioner Huell did, in case someone's watching it, to know which way to go, whether to, log out or skip through it. But if it's important for the presentation, I'm okay with us doing it with a proper warning for someone who would want to also opt out at this point.
sorry for interrupting you there for a second, Commissioner Wright. I guess insofar as people are being bombarded with images like this, so I just feel like it's important that people know this is going to be another image of police killing a black man. So, I know that there's a lot of people that are tired of seeing that sort of thing all over social media and television. So,
I will support my colleague Commissioner Huell on this. At this point, I think we've been through almost a 40-minute presentation. We've understood the mechanics of tasers. I think we're all familiar with tasers. This video provides, if it depicts somebody getting killed, this video doesn't provide much of anything to persuade anyone on this body at this point. So in light of that, I will support my colleague who objects to it.
Well, I will say this, whether or not we watch the video, but it is directly relevant to the conversation tonight. And I think the chief said, his position was, had these officers had another option, and that's where Captain Daniel started tonight, that it may have had a different outcome.
And I can imagine that from any police shooting, with all due respect. I have plenty of respect for the chief. I respect his position, but in my imagination right now, I can imagine police shooting and killing someone. I hate to imagine that. And I can imagine that more tools might help prevent that. So,
okay. Can I offer a suggestion that might, I think, solve or resolve the issue we have here? I think what I would ask Captain Daniels to do is to begin the video, but skip the part where the individual is shot and just go to the section where the critique afterwards. More important to me in this video than the actual shooting event. We all know what happens. The man gets shot. More important to me than that in this video is the fallout from the community and the aftermath, where the expectation is, why did the police not have this valuable, widely accepted, necessary tool that could have been used to prevent this from happening? So if with you all's approval, I think an alternative, if we don't want to show the shooting part, is to jump it to the point where we're showing the discussion after the fact. Does that sit well with everyone?
I think that's a reasonable course of action.
That's reasonable.
Harrison, can you make that happen, please?
And if you need to stop sharing for a moment so that you can move forward to kind of that after discussion.
I think what happens is once he loads it up, it'll be in a pause mode. He can actually drag it forward to the point where, it won't show those parts, and then we'll go from there. But I'll leave it up to. He's very capable, so I'll leave it up to him. He knows what we want. You got it, Harrison?
Yes, I guess give me 1 second then, and I'll get it prepped.
As he's getting that prep, let me just mention that I will have him push out some of the links to some of that research that was done if folks are interested in reading more about some of the research that was done that he mentioned earlier. So I'll push that out through the manager.
I'd appreciate that research, definitely.
I'll get it to the manager and he'll push it out to you.
Thank you.
Okay, are y'all able to see my video screen now?
Yeah, we've got it.
All right, so I'll play it from this point moving forward. And like Chief Spruill mentioned, what he was asking to show here is more of the community conversation after the fact.
At Wednesday's news conference, Philadelphia District Attorney Larry Krasner said the officers failed to properly respond to the 911 call requesting help with a domestic mental health crisis.
And I don't think there's any dispute that in this particular situation, when a mother was trying to get help with a situation involving her son, who is blameless for having mental illness, that when she did that, government failed because her son was killed within a minute of government's arrival. As a part of government, I apologize for that.
Last week, Wallace's family lawyer, Shaka Johnson, said the officers involved should probably not be charged with murder as they lacked training and equipment to handle the situation.
Those particular officers were only given a tool by which to assassinate, which is a service weapon chock full of ammunition, but nothing in between. No taser, no less than lethal device that would have been so appropriate in this particular circumstance.
This gotta stop. It really gotta stop.
Wallace's mother and the family last week said they would like to see all Philadelphia police officers equipped with tasers.
And so that captures the elements of the video, essentially. I'm going to switch my screen back over.
Thank you for adjusting your presentation.
Absolutely. And again, I don't mean to cause any heartache or alarm. And I understand that, again, this isn't about shock and awe or anything like that. But really, my intention personally is to convey to y'all that we truly recognize the human impact that use of force has. And we do recognize how serious and significant it is. Are y'all able to see my PowerPoint now?
Yeah, it's back on.
All right. So I'm going to try to sum up as quickly as possible. And I know I've been kept y'all for a while, but really what this all means to me, to our department, to the chief, is that we believe that this is a reasonably safe and effective option. It's an additional option for our officers to have, and it's an option that they can resort to or rely on prior to using deadly force, or where it's appropriate, and where time and circumstances dictate that it would be usable and effective. And so we see it again, like I mentioned earlier, as one additional option that we think options are linked to improve safety and improved effectiveness. The last thing I want to leave y'all with is just a couple of things to put some stuff in context. This is some data that you can pull easily off of our website. Shows you use of force, specifically Taser, and this is captures several years. When you look at 2019 and compare back to our citizen contacts, what you can see is how small compared to how often we interact with the community that our officers actually deploy a taser. And the number to the right of 39 is 41. And what that means is how often officers only displayed the taser when they drew it. And the reason that's important is because when we look at our data from 2019, we see that when officers pulled their tasers out, 60% of the time, the only thing they had to do was present the taser, and they did not actually fire the taser. And so what that suggests to us is that when the taser is being used, it serves as a deterrent just visually before actually being applied, and no force is even necessary beyond that point involving the taser. And two, that our officers are they're extremely restrictive in their use, and they take it seriously. And they don't just pull the taser out and use it. They're very cautious with how they use it. And that's what this data suggests to us. Now, when we talk about the effectiveness of the taser, this is our internal data. Specifically, this captures 2019, our most recent annual capture of data. Our officers reported to us that they found the taser was either effective or it had limited effectiveness 86% of the time. And that's extremely important because we believe it is a very effective and a very reliable tool. But even so, we do have 14% there, which is why we're looking to continue improving. Primary reasons for ineffectiveness is one or more probes might miss. The probes may not actually make contact with the skin, for example, when a subject is wearing heavy clothing or jackets. And sometimes if the probe spread is too narrow, it doesn't achieve that neuromuscular incapacitation. What's important is that we hope and we believe that this will, the Taser 7 would actually improve on that limited effectiveness, or where there are some of those areas to improve upon. And it's advanced its features in several ways. It gives the officers the opportunity to use an arc display, which further we believe will create a deterrent prior to the Taser being deployed. And what that means is it allows for the electricity to visually spark without actually firing the probes. And so we believe that serves as one additional option to use the Taser before actually even deploying the Taser. And it gives an opportunity to safely de-escalate. They've given us options now where we can have both a narrow and a wide probe spread within the same device, which gives us the opportunity to use it at close range or further out and be effective. So again, more options. That also has a secondary probe deployment, so that in that case where the first one misses and it's not effective in that moment, officers can immediately redeploy the Taser and gain that effective neuromuscular incapacitation and safely bring the incident under control. They've also improved their probe accuracy by changing some of the dynamics of the flight path, and then they've improved their data collection. And so we think that though it is currently a safe and currently an effective tool, again, just like everything else, there's always room for improvement. And the Taser 7 has made some significant changes to improve some of the limitations that we see. The final thing I want to leave y'all with is just please check out our transparency and policing page. This is just a quick snapshot of our cover, our homepage. And if you look here, what I'm going to pull up real quickly is what that looks like when you go to our transparency and policing. And so you can see we're posting our data, our numbers publicly and openly, everything from use of force numbers to training hours to complaints and discipline. We have an annual report here. If you haven't looked at it, please take a look. If y'all can see this, I hope you can. This is an interactive document that allows you to see how we're complying with the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. And we're planning to come out with a second phase to be even more interactive, which will allow you from this document to click additional links to see the actual policies and the actual proofs of how we're complying. And that's something that's currently in progress. When we go back to our transparency and policing page, you can see over here on the left in the gray box, there's several places you can look. We're producing annual compliance reports that shows all of our activities each year in our high risk categories and what we consider to be our significant activities, from bias-based policing to complaints and discipline, grievances, recruitment. And we're reporting this out annually, and we're posting it publicly because we want to be transparent to the the public about what we do as a police department. We also have our Kalia assessment reports, and this is available too, where we have outside accreditation assessors come in and inspect us to make sure we're meeting all the national standards and state standards that we're required to remain in an accredited agency. And these are their reports. We provided a frequently asked questions page. And so a lot of people have questions and they don't know the answer, they don't know who to contact. They can go directly to this page, and there's a lot of questions here with good information. And if you click on any one of them, there's additional links in there that'll either link you to additional resources, our current policies, and a variety of other information. And then also we're posting out publicly our policies. And what's really critical here at the very top is we have a form for feedback. We're looking for feedback from you, our commissioners and mayor, from our community on what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, where we can improve. And this is one opportunity to do that. And they can comment on any one of our policies. And as we continue publishing and updating, this website will also update. And so what I want to leave y'all with this is that we want to work with our community to keep the community safe, to bring those volatile situations that we ultimately have to respond to, under control safely, under control as quickly as possible, and minimize the amount of injury or harm that could be caused from that type of situation. And beyond that, we want to be transparent with our community, and we want to show our community what we're doing. We want to have these types of conversations and get feedback. We're looking to always improve. And I hope that I haven't taken too much of y'all's time tonight. But with that, I'll conclude. And if there's any questions, we're very happy to answer them.
Harrison, before we move into the question period, I did want to acknowledge, and you may not have even been aware of this, that after you played your video, for some reason, the screen became a little bit blurry. And so it was hard for them to read and see what you were going through on the Transparency website. Okay. What I will say is that Transparency website is at our normal website. You're welcome to go through it, browse around, look at it, and all the things that you just talked about are available there. I think at this time, Mayor, unless you want to go in a different direction, we're available for questions at this point.
Fantastic, Chief. I appreciate that. And thank you, Captain Daniel. Thanks for the presentation. I've got a handful of commissioners with questions. Commissioner Myers, Commissioner Houle, Commissioner Wright, and Commissioner Denson. We'll go from there. Commissioner Link as well. So I'm going to go ahead and ask Commissioner Myers to kick it off, because I think she noted in the chat she was interested in placing this in the context of all other uses of force. So you can go ahead and ask the question, Commissioner Myers.
Thank you, Mayor Gertz. I am looking at the transparency page on the police department information, and I appreciate. But I had a question here about breaking down the other uses of force in 2019. At the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned there were 283 uses of force and that there were 39 deployments of tasers in 2019. I'm kind of looking at the numbers here, but they don't all quite add up to the 283. So perhaps you could get us that information. But while I have you here, I have looked at this before, and there's a whole section on soft control, empty hands, and I'm assuming that is included in the use of force, and I don't really understand what that means versus hard control strikes, compliance tools. So if you could elaborate on some of the other non-lethal uses of force. And the other question I would have, again, is information I would like. And I did cover a lot of this material at the police academy that I went through, and I would have liked this information then as well. If we could get some more detailed information on the use, the de-escalation curriculum, because I think that's really, really important. And through that training, I know that you have it, I know the titles of it, but I would like to learn as much about what goes on during that de-escalation training as the uses of force. As an adult educator, there's different ways that could be done. I would just like more of that for the future. But right now, could you just actually explain to me what the compliance tools, hard control, strikes, soft control, empty hands are in terms of use of force?
Sure. So the difference between that, when we say soft control, empty hands, we're referring to simply grabbing somebody by the wrist or having to do a joint manipulation. For example, like having to, pull their arm behind their back. When we're talking about hard control and strikes, that would be specifically the use of a strike, a kick, a punch, something to that effect. So that's the difference between those two generally. One of the reasons that the numbers might seem a little bit off is because when we tabulate this, when you see some of the breakdown, that's based on the individual uses or types within a specific incident. So conceivably, what happens is an officer has to use two different types of force within the same incident. And so that can account for why those numbers would be different.
You have compliance tools on here as well. And now that we're talking about that, you haven't mentioned the use of the pepper spray as well. Where does that fall in? Because don't you all carry that as well?
We do carry pepper spray, yes, ma'am.
Is that included in this use of force list?
I can't see the list specifically that you're referring to at the moment. But yes, we do account for pepper spray. So anything, any type of force that's used is accounted for in our numbers. And we can certainly provide greater detail and breakdown. I don't see exactly what's in front of you at the moment.
It's from the transparency page, and maybe that's under compliance tools, but that's not clear on that page. So if we could have some clarification on those other uses of forces, that would be wonderful.
Let me add a couple of quick things. I believe that what you're looking at is all inclusive. So that would include the what you call pepper spray, and that would also include any striking instrument, a baton. And the last thing I'll say here is that I'm really happy to hear that you're interested in learning more about our de-escalation training. We do that every time that we do a local training for any of our new people. And I would welcome any one of you to come and sit through that 1 day of training to actually see what is going on there. I'm asking a lot of Lieutenant Daniels, but I'm also going to push out a link to you through the manager that will take you to the page that talks about what is happening in that training and what we're training on, and showing you some videos and things. But I think being in the classroom and seeing what we're teaching our officers is invaluable. And so you will get an invite. We'll let you know when that's going to occur again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner Myers. I think Commissioner Houle was up next.
Thank you, Mayor. I would like to get back on stack, so to speak, for after we've kind of worked through our questions specific to the presentation, because I have some other concerns or questions more broadly, but I'll save those for later. And thank you, Captain Harrison, Chief Spruill, and the ACCPD for putting this together and being here to answer our questions. I guess my first questions are along the lines of the idea that the Taser is an alternative to the gun. And, we had a record number of officer-involved shootings in 2019, 6 of them in total, with 13 officers involved in who fired their weapons. Please correct me if I'm wrong about those stats. But my understanding is all of those officers were equipped with tasers at the time. Is that correct?
That should have been, yes.
Okay. And in how many of those incidents was the taser deployed before the gun was used?
So I can't speak to each individual incident at the moment. I don't have those in front of me. I haven't prepared for each one of those cases. But what's important to remember about, I guess, in an attempt to answer your question, when it comes to the Taser, it's not necessarily an absolute alternative to anything else specific. For example, the firearm or the pepper spray, but it's an additional option that we believe is safe and effective. and it gives our officers an additional option where the time and circumstances permit for use of the taser to safely resolve an incident. And though, in regards to the specific cases you're referring to, it's important to note about those that, one, they were investigated independently by the GBI. They were independently reviewed by our district attorney. And though the district attorney found that the officers in those specific incidents were legally justified and appropriate in the use of deadly force, beyond that, we're still looking to improve. And Chief Spruill could speak about even though those officers were deemed legally justified, we still found it necessary to create some changes in the way we do business and some policy changes to try to prevent those circumstances from happening again. And so we're still looking to improve our responses, even when our officers are justified. And that really does get back to the slide toward the beginning of the presentation when we talk about legal justification versus are we still trying to improve our actions? We're not trying to settle ourselves at the floor of legal justification. We're trying to improve our responses from our officers moving forward after the fact as well.
Let me add that. So in one of those cases, so time and circumstance is always going to be a factor when determining whether a taser is the appropriate choice. When you have a person who is within a few inches of striking you in the face with a machete, or a person who is firing a round at the officer or pointing a gun at the officer, those are not the kinds of situation where the taser would be appropriate to be used. If a person is pointing a gun at the officer, they're not going to pull their taser out. They're going to pull their gun out. If you're shooting a gun at the officer, he's not going to pull a taser out. He's going to use deadly force will be the response for deadly force against the officer. That being said, and I think Captain Harrison mentioned, in every one of those instances, regardless of the fact that the DA and the GBI found that they were justifiable and appropriate, I looked at them and said, I'm the chief of police. I don't like the fact that we had to take a person's life or had to seriously injure a person. What can we do as far as our policies, as far as our tactics, as far as our training, to do as much as we can to prevent that from ever happening again? We're never going to be able to prevent it altogether, but what can we do? And that's where the ICAT training came in. That was something that I had planned on doing when I got here, and the time frame moved up when we started having the shootings. Also, I implemented a policy, an internal policy that went out to everyone that said you will stage, if there's no one being if there's not active violence being carried out, you will stage, you'll get multiple officers, you will formulate a plan to include the possibility of using less lethal and the taser, because we are in the business of valuing human life above everything else. And so those are all things we've done since that happened, to try to prevent it from happening again. But if somebody shoots at an officer or swings a machete at an officer when they're within a few feet of that officer, the officer's response is going to be deadly force, and a taser is inappropriate.
Thank you, Chief. And I think that I feel like where this discussion is headed dovetails well with a remark that was near the end of the video clip that we saw, which is, I agree with the person in that video. It says the fault here is not really with the individual officers so much as, broader context, and resources that we need in the department and in the community. But I will say the other thing that really struck me is that the example in that video, we didn't watch the incident, but it's a man with mental health issues who's armed with a knife. And the idea of why we were shown it is that a taser would be an alternative. Well, we had a woman with mental health issues who was armed with a knife, who's one of those people who was shot and killed. And I understand that that was found to be a legal, lethal use of force, and I'm not interested in having a conversation where we try to shame the officers involved in that scenario. I'm interested in a way forward that really provides meaningful alternatives to the way we're approaching public safety. And what I continue to be unconvinced of is that tasers are really the best investment of more than $1 million in a 5-year commitment. That said, I guess I'll just try to bring this back to like the specific questions I have. The oversight and accountability slide, it seemed to me like that was all basically internal. And so I'm curious where there is a plan for community input and a more public and transparent form of oversight and accountability. Of course, we have discussions happening right now about a police accountability board, but
yeah, I think that the mayor is well underway in implementing a citizens advisory form, and that their purpose will be to do exactly what you were talking about. Also, Captain Daniels mentioned Kalia accreditation. And Kalia accreditation has 480 or more standards that we must comply with that dictate how we track complaints, our investigative processes, and the whole gambit of things. And every 4 years we sit down, they bring outside reviewers in and they look at, we have to have proofs to show that we're doing the things that they have mandated. So they're, even before what the mayor is doing with the civilian advisory board or a committee, we already are doing that. That's available. The last one of those inspections and for years to come is listed at that transparency site. You can go and read the actual document. And, you know, we'd be glad to show you some of those. There's other documents there that talk about bias-based policing, that talk about our complaints and all kind of information about that kind of stuff that's already there. So the answer is I think the mayor is working on that, and we're already doing some of that internally.
And so for anyone viewing at the Government Operations Committee in February coming up, there will be the first conversation about parsing through the draft from the task force that's worked to create the framework for the ongoing advisory body.
Thanks, y'all. And just a few more questions specific to the presentation here. One of them, I guess, is more about the contract with Axon. So this might be more a question for Manager Williams. But have we put out any kind of RFP for contracts with any other companies? I think you're muted, Manager Williams, or the audio's not coming through at least.
Can you hear? Let me try. I think he's muted, and while he's trying to get back on, let me say that. So we've had existing contracts with them. We've gone through the process to clear that up until now. What we're doing now is we're trying to combine those two contracts together and move forward with newer technology and newer equipment. So we are already in contracts with Axon, who has the CEDs as well as the body-worn camera video. So the answer would be no, we don't. We didn't plan on going out for an RFP. That's not necessary in this specific circumstance. What I would say is that the industry of body-worn cameras and the tasers is really the best equipment that's out there is coming from Axon. If we were to decide we were going to shift to something else, I think the cost would be even higher because the things that we've had right now, we'd have to get rid of all of them and start all over again. Number one, part of it is the evidence.com, which is where we have all of our data stored, our video data stored. And so, I think that the question you're getting at is, should we be looking at our RFP to see whether there's somebody else that can give us an equal or better product? And the answer to that is no. And then the final part of that is that we are under contract for the body-worn cameras, I think, for another 3 years, regardless of what we do. They will allow us to, enjoin that with the new contract. But right now, we're still under contract with them for the next 3 years. I hope that answers your question. And I don't know whether Blaine was able to get on or not. Still no audio, sir.
Okay. I mean, I certainly think that covers the basic answer to my question sufficiently. The short version is, and just to kind of for the benefit of the public, what I've understood by email is that we can move forward. I mean, since we're already under contract with Axon for the body cameras, if we wanted to continue with just body cameras, we've already got that contract in place. So the impetus for having this discussion right now is basically to try to also make a contract about tasers as well, under the premise that it would be a cost savings by combining them, right? And what I'm hearing, unless Manager Williams, maybe you can give us a nod or a shake, is that we haven't pursued an RFP with any other companies, correct? Okay. So
can y'all hear me now?
Oh, we can.
Yeah.
Sorry, I had to switch microphone source. Yes, as the chief said, they were extending some existing contracts that had gone through a competitive procurement in the past. And that was the whole premise, I think, for bringing this forward, was that there were some contractual efficiencies for, the same vendor providing us body cameras and tasers and combining that into one. So there had, to my knowledge, and Chief reaffirmed that, there has been no other RFP issued for tasers at this point.
Can I add one other quick point that's very relevant to this, and that is Captain Daniels talked about technology, where if you have an Axon taser and an Axon body-worn camera, when you turn that Axon taser on, it automatically activates not just that officer's body-worn camera, but every officer that's in the Wi-Fi region there. And so if you went with a different vendor, you would lose that technology because they're not compatible.
Mm-hmm. Although there's still, well, okay. Yeah, I mean, you still have to activate it yourself if you're using a gun or something, but all right, so
that's a good mention, but there is technology that comes with the next upgrade that and Harrison, help me out if I'm wrong here, that allows and we've tested and evaluated this, where when you pull your gun, it does the same thing. It turns on the body-worn cameras of everyone in the area. Is that correct, Harrison? You're muted.
You're muted.
Yes, sir. So we have looked at that. That is some emerging technology as well, so that what we can have is that anytime an officer even draws their gun from their holster, that it would actually activate every body camera within the specific range or the region or the range of that device that would be attached to the holster. We've been doing some test and evaluation with it. And at this point, it's still an ongoing process, but that's something we're looking toward as well. So it goes beyond just the taser itself. It goes to the firearm too.
But we have a policy in place for officers to be activating their body cams whenever they're interacting with someone in an incident, correct?
Sure, that's correct. The critical reason that's important, though, is that there is potential always that something happens very quickly, and then in the heat of the moment, it's a slip of judgment or slip of they just don't think about it in the moment because something happens right in front of them. And if they had to draw their firearm, it would account for that and automatically activate, even if an officer forgot, or in hopefully the unlikely event that an officer intentionally chose not to turn on their camera, it would automatically do it. So it's another check, another fail-safe.
Okay. Well, I had just a couple other questions about the presentation. I feel like my section's taken a while, so I'm happy with just very brief answers to these. But the training slides, I'm curious how often those trainings are revisited. For example, you talked about people get them right at the front, but are those recurring on an annual or biannual basis? Or is it a one-time kind of thing?
Yes, sir. Every year, officers are required to go through a minimum amount of de-escalation training, community-oriented policing training. We opened the initial classes that our new officers go to back up to all of our officers, and they do come in and attend, but there is a minimum requirement for that type of training annually.
And do you have anything that lays out kind of the proportion, so to speak, of those trainings? For example, if someone's getting, 2 hours of bias training per year, but 2 hours of firearm training per week or something, then that would be kind of a
Right. So we could, I don't have those numbers with me tonight, but we could certainly look at that and prepare something for you moving in the future.
I think that information is made available through our frequently asked questions slide. There's a breakdown of the different types of training that we do. If that won't suffice, we'll be glad to do an additional breakdown of the training.
Okay. And then I know you pointed out in your presentation, Captain Harrison, that tasers can be deadly. They're a less frequently deadly use of force, but is there any way to identify through training if someone has a heart condition or a medical device that would put them at risk? And some things are sort of obvious, but a lot of times people can have equipment built into their bodies that we're unaware of, or conditions that are not visible when you're seeing someone.
Sure. I do want to clarify. I didn't say that they can be deadly, but there are risks involved and there are limitations to the device. But as far as like if you're speaking about a pacemaker or something like that, I mean, that would be difficult to tell just from looking at somebody, but there is research specifically about pacemakers, and we could pull some of that and send it to you if you'd like to review it and look at some of that type of research.
I'd certainly be interested in reviewing that. I mean, I've read reports on the deadliness of tasers that are not part of this presentation tonight, but I also am interested in any information you want to send along would be great. And my last question here is just about the history of the use of the taser in ACCPD. My understanding is that Chief Lumpkin was opposed to tasers and that we did not start equipping officers with tasers here until after he left. Is that correct?
No, that is not correct. Your understanding is absolutely not correct. So what happened is just prior to his leaving the Athens-Clarke County Police Department, Chief Lumpkin was in the process of going through the research and making recommendations to acquire tasers for the police department. Unfortunately, and so we have documentation showing that. What happened was he left to go to another police department, and the beginning of the tasers took place under a person named Carter Green, who was an acting chief for a period of time. But the original concept, idea, and thought about employing or deploying tasers came originally under Chief Lumpkin. I've actually spoken with him.
Okay. Well, thank you for correcting that. I've heard opposite from other people on this call before. So if anybody wants to chime in, if there's a different understanding, but I appreciate you setting the record straight if I was wrong about that, Chief Spruill.
I think it's fair to say that had been an earlier position of Chief Lumpkin, but I think as Chief Spruill noted, he left the department in a different mindset than he might have had in some years prior.
Okay. Well, the other broader thoughts I have, I'll save for at the end if I can come back and just kind of give a spiel. But in case that's one more thing about the presentation is just that I think that the fact that we almost showed that video reveals some shortcomings we might have as a local government in being fully trauma informed. And so part of the broader discussion I think we need to look at includes some things that came up in this presentation. And then as well, the use of force report that we're referencing, I'd like space. I don't think it really makes sense tonight because this seems to be much more focused on kind of just tasers. But among the many things in that report that I think really warrant discussion as soon as possible is the fact that 81% of subjects involved in use of force incidents in 2019 were Black, and 75% of the officers involved in those incidents were white males.
Those are some elements we definitely want to capture for the follow-up conversation. Had Commissioner Wright up next.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I want to thank Captain Daniel for the presentation and Chief Spruill for the information as we were having this important discussion. I missed the meetings that got us to this point for additional clarification on the contract. So I'm glad that I'm learning more details about that. And I do support the money savings that you're going with by grouping these two important pieces of equipment. Really glad that we invested in the body cameras back when we did, and so that has been available. for us. A couple questions is, when the taser is a choice, does it need to be a choice where the person is by themselves, so that an associate, like if they were standing close to somebody else, you wouldn't want somebody getting the taser effect? You know what I mean? If you touch somebody who's being tasered, do you get the shock as well? I guess that's my question.
No, ma'am, actually. So if somebody is under the under the electricity, it's perfectly safe to touch that individual person. In fact, we train our officers to move in and attempt to place the person in handcuffs while the device is active, and it's safe to do so because the current runs between the two probes. So as long as they don't touch the probes or the wires, they'll be okay. But in the event that they did touch the wires, that does happen with our officers on occasion. It's just kind of like a momentary little shock, and that's it.
Okay, and that was the visual for when you were showing how officers experienced the taser. I could see that there were two other officers to help break the fall, and it sounds like that's also happening in the field, the ability to maybe to move in and break the fall, as well as then do the handcuffing. And those are typically paired together, that the tasing is being done for the objective of getting the handcuffs on.
So the purpose of the taser is to attempt to incapacitate the movement of the individual, so that it gives officers an opportunity to safely control them and put them in handcuffs. Yes.
Right. And then I think that I've also observed or read in reports the taser was ineffective. And when those kind of incidents happen, I guess I'm looking for some clarification on if it's a malfunction of the taser or if it's literally the makeup of an individual or the situation is such that the taser doesn't resolve the effect that's anticipated.
I'm going to let Captain Daniels respond to that question, but in his answer, I want him to cover the difference between how a taser works and how other pain compliance weapons work, because most weapons, whether it's OC spray, a baton, a kick, a punch, rely on administering enough pain to get the person to do what we want them to do. And somebody who's high on drugs or somebody who has a high pain tolerance can fight through that. So Captain Daniels, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure. So that is true. The taser, though it does cause pain and discomfort, the purpose is not specifically creating as much pain as possible to get the person to give up. The purpose is to physically stop or create a cessation of their movement so that they're incapacitated, compared to, for example, the baton or hard strikes or something to that effect. The purpose is to and that is pain compliance, so the person is voluntarily gives up. Those things also result more likely in injuries, which is why we still argue that the taser is a safer option. And you did have something in the earlier part of your question. I can't remember if you would remind me.
I guess it was clarification on when if it's a taser doesn't work, or like you're saying, the threshold doesn't get the effect of the individual, as Chief Spruill said, doesn't get the effect. And then I guess I was looking for clarity on what the next point was.
Sure. So I think the first thing to really understand is when you look at, various data on effectiveness, there's a wide range out there, and different departments and different studies calculate that in a different way. They define and term effectiveness differently, and they categorize it differently. But what it comes down to is there's a variety of reasons a taser might not be effective in a specific situation. It could be the limitation of part of it's just the dynamics. Actually, it's the rapidly evolving situation. And so, for example, when a subject's moving and a taser is deployed, one probe might miss because the person moves very quickly, and then that limits the effectiveness of the taser. In some situations, it could be a matter of training that has an impact on the limited effectiveness. So there's a variety of reasons, but the typical reasons that it might not be ineffective are probe misses, the probe not having the appropriate distance apart between the two probes to achieve that neuromuscular incapacitation, or the probes don't actually make contact with the skin. And those are the primary reasons that it's ineffective initially.
Okay, and so that covers, I think, what we had heard a little bit about extensive clothing. Lots of layers of clothing is another judgment call that would have the taser not be a choice in the moment. And I guess the distance, you're saying that it works within 25 feet. That's a long range.
Yes, ma'am. And so just as a reminder too, every set of facts and circumstances in a use of force event are unique, and officers are making split-second decisions as far as what they need to do to respond to that situation to safely resolve it.
Okay.
And that none of the tools, none of the strategies that we use, not even de-escalation, are always 100% effective. And again, there's limitations and risks in everything we do. And what we're trying to do is maximize our options available so that we can overcome the limitations and overcome the risks involved in every different strategy, tool, or tactic that we might have available.
Let me add,
Thanks.
Commissioner Wright, that the Taser 7 actually comes with an additional feature. With the tasers we currently have, if you get one probe connection but the other one misses, that whole cartridge is no longer any good. The new Taser 7, if you have one connected and the other one misses, and you fire another one, that second taser probe, if it connects, then you have your connection. So there's some additional features to the to the Taser 7 that were not available for that very reason. If whatever reason you don't get a connection.
Okay, thank you. And I was also impressed with the way that the policy in our department, our police department, is for that 2-second threshold of it, as well as that it only is active for 2 seconds until redone, and that it's synchronized with the body camera. I think that's excellent as well. And then I think that covers what was coming to my mind, and what I am hoping as we continue to learn more and more, and I did think that this was important information for us, is, Mr. Mayor, is when we move forward, I would like us to be learning about use of force. Sounds like this one, the Taser, is like a individual use of force category option, and for us to learn about a tool. But then there's also going to be group strategies and options, a group event, and use of force. And it seems to me if we can learn some of those and maybe broken up or as a comparison of options for group events. And then I also wanted to circle back around. I'm glad that the Government Operations Committee is going to be looking at the task force draft, but I wanted to remind everybody that it was February 11 last year when we had the National Association of Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, NACOL. They came and gave a 4-hour presentation to the mayor and commission, and I believe that Commissioner Hamby and I are the only seated commissioners that were there for that full day. Correct me if I'm wrong, if I've left anybody out. But I think that us having that presentation again is relevant for all of us, whether while GOC is studying it or in conjunction with it. But I think that would be something that we would want to strive for 100% attendance, so that we can all understand the information that they brought up about the Citizens Oversight Committee. That is a goal that we've been working on for a couple of years now, and I know the pandemic slowed that momentum down, because in February 11 we were ready to get going on it. So that's what I'm hoping for as we continue to learn and make improvements. Thanks for my time I yield the rest of my time to, I think, Commissioner Denson's up next.
I think I've got Link, Denson, and then Davenport, and then I know Jesse wanted to speak again.
I yield the rest of my time to Commissioner Link.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Chief Spruill and Officer Harrison for presenting this information. I think a lot of it is extremely helpful, and I'm certainly grateful for the options for non-lethal force options. You know, I do believe that there are times when an officer must use force. You know, whether they're facing someone who's mentally incapacitated or thoroughly has malintentions. And I, you know, the more I learn about this, the more I recognize that, you know, the newest, latest technology is probably all the better because it enhances that level of transparency, and you know, most likely would decrease the likelihood of something going wrong. And, you know, I do recognize the policy, and there are pretty strict guidelines as to when these different levels of force are used. My question is, you know, especially in light of recent events and recent events in DC. I mean, I grew up 17 miles from Capitol Hill, so I'm very kind of personally traumatized by recent events, but I can't say that I'm surprised. You know, I've been concerned for quite a while about those kind of incidents and that particular right-wing movement coming to violence, particularly violence against governments and violence against liberal and progressive governments. And I'm, you know, these policies we have on use of force. I'm wondering, you know, what happens when an officer chooses not to use that force on particular perpetrators, even though it is the option, and what courses has this local police department taken to assure that there are not officers within our police force who might be sympathetic to those anti-government movements and you know, violent racist movements, quite frankly, that have brought this nation to where it is. You know, I'd like to know that officers are not being selective on which bodies they use force on.
Let me take a shot at those. There was two questions there, and the first one is an excellent question, because here lies the conundrum. How do we make sure that our officers have the tools and equipment and have the training and know when force is appropriate to use, but making sure we toe that fine line that they absolutely do not use it when it's not appropriate, and make sure that our officers understand where that balance is, because I don't want to be critical of what happened at the Capitol the other day, but I think you see the police chief resign, and there's some things that happen where folks are going, why were you not in a position and why didn't you take more action to stop that? So it's this question about, do we overreact or do we underreact, and where is that line at? And it's not a clearly defined line. So I thank you for the question, but we don't really have an answer. We're working on it hard to try to make sure our officers have the equipment and they know when they can use force, and they're not so nervous about what's going to happen after the fact and the criticism and scrutiny that they're going to take, that they don't use force when they need to. So that's the conundrum, and I appreciate the question. The second question you asked was, how do we know that we don't have people within our midst that are sympathetic to those kind of causes? What I will say to you is that we go through an extensive background check, where we look at everything from social media. We put them in front of a psychiatrist. We do a psychological evaluation. And I can tell you for a fact, I can't share the specific individuals, but I can tell you for a fact that there are people who I said, you're not a suitable candidate to be on the Athens-Clarke County Police Department, based on what I saw on the internet that suggested that they had inappropriate views. Most of the time that's going to be caught when they go through a psychological evaluation. because that psychological evaluation is going to ask questions specifically geared toward that. So we've got checks and balances to weed those folks out because they got no business being on our police department. But however, we are just like any other large organization. The number of people that we have, occasionally someone will slip through the cracks, or somebody might have come through with one set of views and values, and those changed over time. When we become aware of it, I'm going to do everything I can to, as quickly as I can, terminate them from my employment with my department because it has no place here. I don't know whether that answers your question.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, part of my concern is, I know that I did have a brief conversation with Acting Chief Hunsinger a couple years ago about this, and asked him, what the procedure was and as far as monitoring social media and stuff. And at that time, he said they were just beginning to do that. So, I understand that there are plenty in the force that, might not have gone through that extra level of investigation. So you're saying that, even older officers who might not be subject to this greater scrutiny are now subject to it.
Well, and anybody that I'm hiring now is subject to that. And if it comes up as part of an investigation, or if I see something that is inappropriate, that is likely to bring discredit to the department and to the county, then I'm going to address it through discipline. And I don't feel that people who have those kind of extreme views have any business being in an Athens-Clarke County uniform.
But there's no procedure to, in retrospect, put some of the older officers who did not go through that level of scrutiny through that scrutiny.
Not at this point. It's certainly something we can sit down and talk about. I've seen other places where every 2 years they will fund an opportunity for all officers to go through a kind of recheck psychological evaluation to make sure that they're okay. I think that's good. I think that's healthy. I think it's something we may want to consider here, but those are broader conversations that we've got to have at some other point. I'm in favor of it, but I would want to involve certainly the manager and HR in that discussion.
I'd just like to voice my favor for putting, our officers through psychological evaluation on a very regular basis. I mean, this is one of the most stressful jobs out there. And I know that police officers are more likely to commit suicide, be involved in domestic abuse. They're put through a lot. And I feel like our officers should have the opportunity to receive that mental health care on a regular basis, not just to look out for inappropriate associations and sympathies, but for their own personal mental health and that of their families.
I'd be glad to have that discussion at some point in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks, Melissa. I had Commissioner Denson, then Commissioner Davenport, and then anybody else who hasn't had a chance to speak before we circle back around again.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Captain Daniel, and thank you, Chief Sproul, for being here with us and giving us the presentation. One of my questions was already touched on a little bit, so I just try to get a little more specific an answer. Captain Daniel, you talked about the ability for us to have where all of the badge cams or body cams on officers in an area when a taser is deployed turn on. That's something that we're looking into and working on. Is that what do we need to do to have that put in place? Is that requiring the new kind of taser, the Taser 7, or what is that requiring us to do to have it implemented?
So that technology comes with upgrading our body cam specifically, along with the Taser 7 as well, but it's the body cam specifically that we would need to upgrade. So like I said, we are still looking at that particular model. They have now what's called the Body 3, and that's the upgraded version from what some of our officers are carrying now that carries that technology.
Okay. And I guess this might slide over to Manager Williams. With this contract, and with, if I remember correctly, this is a joint contract for body cams and for tasers both. Is that possible for us to be using those new cameras that Captain Daniel was talking about, or?
Well, I'm going to defer that to the chief on the technical side.
Yeah.
Chief, do you understand the question? You're muted, sir.
I'm not sure I understand the question, sir.
If you don't mind, I might be able to answer that.
Please.
The body 3 specifically, like, I don't know if you can see the chest. This is the body 2 that I'm wearing. It is a body camera, particularly assigned to people like me who be administrative or investigators based on what they're doing and their work assignments. What you see with the officers on the street is the flex cam, which is the one that has the camera, if you've seen it, that kind of connects up on their head. And that allows them to be able to see, the camera can see when they turn and pivot their head. This one has a front facing only. What we're looking really toward is the that technology to be extended to the flex at some point. So it's now, it's on the body 3s moving forward, but we see much greater advantage in the flex cameras to capture what the officer's seeing in that moment as they turn their head. And that's technology that's still coming in the future. And we've been talking to Axon about that.
Okay, thank you. I think I understand what you're saying, Vince, but thank you for clarifying that. And then my last question is, you had the numbers up where you showed the number of times the taser was simply branded or presented and wasn't actually used. Going back to your transparency page that y'all have, which I really appreciate, that is up there, and that is definitely a great tool. On that, I guess and maybe this is an incorrect expectation, but I guess I would expect to see the number of times that a firearm is presented to go down after the tasers were implemented and being used by our department, but instead the number of times firearms was presented went up and stayed up even after tasers were implemented. Is there a way that possibly our training can be changed just to try to find a way to prioritize the branding of that whenever you don't think you're necessary, just trying to de-escalate a situation? Is there any way that we could be changing our policies to try to have it where the taser is being displayed and presented rather than the firearm?
So let me point out that one is not intrinsically tied to the other. And what I mean by that is just because you have a taser doesn't mean it's going to change the number of cases where you have to present a firearm. I can do some more research and have our crime analysts look into it, but I would suggest that the increase in the drawing of firearms is intrinsically tied to the increase in the number of gun calls that we have, where if a person has a gun, this is not a type of call that it would be appropriate to draw a taser out. If a person has a gun, the officer is going to have a gun out. And if you look at our number of gun calls and the number of aggravated assaults involving people being shot, you'll see that the trajectory is going up significantly. But I don't have that data here. I'm just saying that the idea that the number of times that a gun is going to come out should be impacted by the number of times that a taser or the implementation of the taser. There may be a little bit of truth to that, but it's going to be more tied to the number of gun calls and violence that we're dealing with. I can certainly look at more information and maybe try to get something there, but that's kind of what I think is causing the increase.
Okay, yeah, I would appreciate that, Chief. And also, I mean, yeah, like you said, the data on the number of gun calls too. I mean, I would like to be able to see that increase and what's going on there and try to discuss that in the future too. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. All right, I had Commissioner Davenport next.
Thank you, Daniels and Sproul, for your time. So Commissioner Hull had asked most of my questions concerning like competitiveness of contracts, the RP process, but I do have, and I'll be short and sweet, a couple of questions. First is Axon top of the line, like when it comes to cost, efficiency, the reliability of the product, and do other neighboring communities, are they as transparent as we are when it comes to how we do our transparency on the ACCPD webpage? And my last question is, How many people have been hospitalized or died due to tasers in Athens-Clarke County since implementation? That's it.
So I caught a lot of questions, I guess, about reliability and durability, a few other things. There's a whole, I can provide you some additional links to some of the specs on the devices that lays out some more technical data about the reliability and durability of the physical device itself. If y'all would like that, there's some links that will provide more of those types of specifications. I don't have that data in front of me at the moment. And also, I don't have the data in front of me, but we could certainly look into the number of, I guess what you're kind of getting to broadly is the severity of injuries that would have occurred or potentially could have occurred after the Taser deployment since we started using them, how many people have been hospitalized. We could certainly pull those numbers and look at that for you.
Let me say we actually have already pulled those numbers, and I believe I provided that data to Manager Williams, and the answer is that we have not had a serious injury involving a Taser. I don't believe we've taken anybody to the hospital, but I will go back and confirm that and get that data to you again. With respect to the Axon being the industry leader, you are exactly correct. Axon is the industry leader and the standard. In addition to the fact that their product, they've been doing it longer and provide a better product. In addition to that, they also have insurance that covers the police departments. It goes up to $10,000. I'll have Harrison explain a little bit more of what that all covers, but warranties and also a level of expertise. So they'll provide a subject matter expert to come into court that will provide data and back their product. So they are absolutely the top of the line industry standard. You asked a question about transparency and how we stack up to others in this region. I can tell you, and I've worked Captain Daniels tremendously on trying to get our transparency website up. I think we stack up against anybody in the state of Georgia, and we are not finished yet. We're continuing to build on that and improve. I think the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, that our compliance with that, Captain Daniels was actually moving fast, but we've already started linking it where if you click on one of the compliance standards, it'll actually take you to a video that talks about these are the things that we're doing to be in compliance with that standard. Frequently asked questions and other information. I think we are a leader in Georgia, one of the leaders in Georgia, and we were not that way 2 years ago when I got here. So I think those are just a little more insight and answers to the questions you asked.
And just to add one thing, I do have I think what the chief's referring to, it was a report run for at least the year-to-date 2020 data concerning injuries in the Taser. And based on our year-to-date information, we have no serious bodily injuries that required hospitalization or anything like that for medical treatment based on use of the Taser so far in 2020 this year.
Can you get that data for, well, first of all, that's very important information. Considering the fact that no one has been hospitalized or, seriously injured by the use of Taser, because as a Black man, I'd rather be tasered than shot. But can you get that information for previous years as well?
Yes, we can look at that as well.
Oh, did Chief Spruill mention that to date, that the information that Blaine Williams was supposed to send out, were you stating that to date, since we started using Taser in Athens-Clarke County, that no one has been injured or seriously, or is that just for the year of 2020 or 2019?
No, I don't think we've gone back year to date. I think one of the previous questions that was asked, I can't remember by who, dealt with this year. And so this year in 2020, and we're 9 months to 10, at the time when we gave that information out in 2020, we had no hospitalizations. So we'll go back and get you some more better information, and we'll go back further on that and get you the information you're asking.
Thank you.
I have Commissioner Thornton, and then any others before I circle back to Commissioner Houle. And you're muted, Avita.
I'm sorry. I am. I kind of interrupted Commissioner Houle when he mentioned about Chief Lumpkin, but I think that information has been corrected. And I did talk to two police officers, a sheriff and a police officer. And I just want to reiterate what both of them said. Tasers tasers are one of the least lethal methods. The other two is the PC spray and the baton. And he also said, and I think Commissioner Link brought this up, and I don't know if that's pertinent for tasers, but he also suggested that there should be psychological testing for officers and to make sure proper training is in place. He gave an example of when he was an officer and a woman was very violent, and the officer beat her with a baton 27 times. And the officer could not get her under control, but he ended up firing the officer because he used the baton in such a dramatic way. I don't think there's going to be one thing is going to be a perfect answer. I do think that we keep talking about de-escalating, and now we have three options. So we just, I think, should support and make sure we have proper training, consequences, and testing, psychological testing, because everything is really mixed up right now. I do think the questions pertaining to the actual contract, I really do appreciate that. I struggle with the pulling apart of some stuff, but the objective questionings that this body should be taking in consideration, I do appreciate that because I really didn't think of it. But I did want to share with you my conversations with a police officer and a sheriff, and suggest that some of my colleagues take the time to talk to these folks themselves to see what the day-to-day is. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner. Russell, Mariah, Mike, anyone else before I circle back to Jesse?
Nope.
I was teaching earlier and got here around 7:30, so I just want to listen in on the conversation, the questions for right now, and if I have anything, you can circle back to me. Thank you, Mayor.
Thanks, Mariah. And Jesse, before I get to you, I do want to make a point of noting that I'm trying to capture everybody's interest in follow-up conversation, the next time we talk kind of more broadly about use of force. And so I just do want to note the things that I've captured so far. There was a question about how ACCPD manages individual versus group use of force. A lot of interest in the disparities in those recipients of our community of force. Lots of interest in preventative and de-escalative activities as an alternate to use of force. Questions about the association of gun presentation with other factors or correlation. And then I would extend that personally to correlation of circumstances with all uses of force. Are there some circumstances that tend to present use of force as follow-up. So I've got those so far. And so just be thinking of others, because at the conclusion of this conversation, I just want to make sure we capture everything. So sorry to jump in front of you, Jesse, but I just wanted to at least summarize my list thus far. But go ahead, Jesse.
I appreciate that, Mayor, and that dovetails well with, I think, part of what I wanted to try to get to here. Tried to take some notes here, but I guess I want to be clear to start here that this is not a critique of staff or ACCPD. I want to thank Captain Harrison and Chief Spruill and the ACCPD staff for their time tonight and beforehand, putting together this presentation, the many reports that are available on our website. I want to be clear that I believe the way forward for our government and our community is going to require a collaborative effort with the police department. And I believe that effort needs to be transparent and public. And it's going to require some difficult conversations where we really need to be honest with each other and look honestly and holistically at both the good things that ACC is doing regarding public safety, but also the challenges we face, including some of the things that I think none of us are proud of talking about that have happened in recent years. I also want to be clear that I echo the sentiments of my colleagues that police officers have an incredibly tough job. I mean, really, like, our society kind of outsources the problems that we face in so many arenas and have like one group of people we call to try to respond to any of a huge number of incidents. And that's existing alongside federal and state divestment from education, from mental health resources, from substance use resources. So I'm under no illusion that like the job that y'all have in the police department is basically impossible. Like you're being asked to do an impossible thing. And I think for us to try to disentangle that like wet yarn ball of a situation is going to require working collaboratively. And I think that's really going to take time. And it's also going to require us really looking honestly at some of the hardest discussions to have. So I guess the concern I'm raising, and this sort of echoes an email I sent earlier, is more for management and my colleagues who like set the agenda moving forward. I really ask that we have time to prepare for these meetings. I'm glad that in a way, tried to get this in sooner. But we only learned about this a week ago. I had to move a bunch of things around on my schedule just to be here. I think others did. Commissioner Parker had a class and couldn't even be here for the presentation. And that also includes getting the materials with enough advance notice to review them ahead of time. I think we could have had a more efficient discussion tonight if we had more time to prepare. I know that's something that we're generally working on, but that would have been especially helpful here. I think there's also an importance in discussing public safety with much more breadth and depth. I think that's going to become my like go-to phrase here. I think if we look back at the past year, there's three things that really stick out that have challenged the country and our community. And it's COVID, elections, and public safety. I mean, we've seen record-breaking protests nation and worldwide, and it's been about police. And I don't think that we're going to get anywhere by running away from that hard discussion. We get briefed on COVID every month and have collaborative, almost like mini work sessions monthly on COVID. I think we do well to treat the questions around public safety with a similar sense of urgency and importance, because we're not hearing any kind of unified request from our community, right? There are people who are out there demanding radically different things of us. And I don't think there's any responsible way we can move forward without really giving time to that discussion in public and not just, by email. So as far as specifics for future work sessions that you're asking for, Mayor Gertz, in addition to really emphasizing that need for time, I think we need to scrutinize the data of our reports. I imagine that would be best done once we have the 2020 reports so we can compare them to 2019. The racial disparity is probably one of my top concerns, but it's certainly not the only one. I'd also really like us to look at other equipment overall, not just tasers, but the use of firearms that Commissioner Denson brought up. Also, drones and military-grade vehicles and things that I feel like we just do well to really try to look at with this kind of holistic mindset in mind. And maybe also learning more about what those hand-to-hand tactics are that y'all are training in. And, how much would it be worth us maybe investing more in some of those kinds of trainings to avoid, the use of lethal or less lethal weaponry. I really think that we're doing ourselves and the community a disservice by not having a public discussion about the events of the summer and the tear gassing. So I just want to publicly ask that we talk about that, as well as the officer-involved shootings of 2019. I really think that we need to talk about the fact that 6 people have been shot, and that was a very new thing. And that I think that points to us not really being the exception that we strive to be in every manner. I'd also really like us to look at the school resource officers, but hopefully whenever we can have a collaborative work session with CCSD. They've been talking about it. My understanding is they just voted tonight that they would like to renew that MOU, but I also know that there's a lot of discussion among that body about what the best way is forward, and whether it's to keep doing the same thing we've been doing. Also, our response to homelessness, I know, is something that's come up a lot. So I'd like us to look at that. Again, just so that, we get emails from the public that present us. I mean, I'll avoid the details, but opposite information from you, Chief Spruill, from what we got from members of the public about a given incident, and so equipping us with the information on a more regular basis just to know and be able to respond to our constituents well about how these situations are handled and what policies we have on the books can be really helpful. I'd really like us to look at arrest data, perhaps with the courts, to look at where people are getting funneled into jail and prison system. I'd really like us to look deeper at our transparency and accountability measures. And generally just that techniques and resources for reducing use of force, which is, the de-escalation point is not just about training, but it's also about how we respond and who's responding. A 911 call comes in, who gets dispatched, how many people go out to the call, things like that. I know that efforts have been made to try to approach things differently than we were in 2019, but I do feel like there's a need to be having, again, more of those discussions and more depth in the public eye. Sorry, I know I'm going on for a bit here, but I guess I'll just kind of end with my thoughts on tasers, which dovetails with generally, I'd like to see these work sessions include experts with different backgrounds. I'm a little, troubled that we're only getting a presentation from the police department on this. And I can pull up articles that tell an opposite story. And I'm not assuming that anything that we've been shown tonight is incorrect or inaccurate or incomplete necessarily, but there's kind of very different information out there. There's an American Public Media article that I circulated to y'all, I think about a month ago, that says tasers are less reliable than their maker has claimed, and the results can be deadly. That's the title of it. And it starts off by saying that while tasers have become an essential tool for police, but how effective are they? In some big cities, tasers are unreliable up to 40% of the time, and in 3 large departments, newer models were less effective than older ones. In 258 cases over 3 years, a taser failed to subdue someone who was then shot and killed by police. It goes on to say that the weapons are produced by Axon, that's who we're looking to renew his contract with, who has a monopoly on the American market. And, anytime a company has a monopoly on a market, I'm wary of the data that were presented by that company about the effectiveness of their devices. So, in short, I feel like this discussion about tasers tonight happening kind of in a vacuum doesn't equip us well to make a decision about a 5-year, multi-million-dollar contract. I think there's still some questions we really need to dig into if we're going to make that kind of a commitment. The costs are high. It's about $250,000 a year is what we'd be looking at for just the taser portion of that contract. If we look at 90 as the average of uses, both including display and deployment, that would be $2,778 dollars for every time that a taser is pulled out. If we look at how many times the taser is actually used, which I think is the thing that we're assuming is preventing something worse from occurring, that would be 39 times in 2019 was the highest amount of any year, $6,410 per use. And I'm just not convinced that that's the best use of $6,410. I mean, we don't have enough crisis intervention response units to have a 24/7 ability to respond. And so if we're really talking about limited funds, my concern remains that tasers may not be the best form of mitigating use of force and keeping people in our community, including our officers, safe. The solution might be more people, different training, more crisis intervention response units, et cetera.
Can I just quickly respond? And this, I'm not going to try to go at each point. There's a lot of information, a lot of things you indicated you want to talk about, and we are absolutely looking forward to the opportunity to sit down with you and the commission to talk about anything that you want to talk about. We don't have any secrets. We're wide open. We'll share that information. But what I will say is this. You talked about some math and you threw some numbers out. And we don't use tasers often. We don't need them often. But when you need them and you don't have them, That's where the problem rests. And so all of those numbers you put out there, I'm appreciative of that. But my response would be, how much is one person's life worth? Because if we save one person's life a year because we have tasers, in my humble opinion, they're worth it. But that's a decision that you and the commission have to make based on the information that you get. Look, if we want to bring some experts in that's going to talk about tasers and why we shouldn't have them, I'll have somebody from Taser International come in and present on their behalf. I think Captain Daniels pushed data and a contact information from Taser out previously to the commission where they could call themselves and talk to them directly. So we're willing to have those difficult conversations. We are willing to bring in the experts, certainly willing to hear, opposing point of view. And the last thing I'm going to say is this, because you hit on some real good points. And it comes back to disproportionality. People of color are disproportionately treated across America. We know that. It's not just in policing. It's in education, acquisition of wealth, healthcare. Any system that you look at in America, you're going to find where people of color are disenfranchised and disproportionately treated. And as a Black police chief of your department, I'm saying we are committed and we are willing to sit down and have those tough conversations and do everything we possibly can to close that gap. You heard a lot of information tonight, and we showed you where we're trying real hard. We're doing a whole lot of difficult stuff, and we're having those difficult circumstances. Unfortunately, policing is not a perfect science, and you're not going to have all the answers, and we're human like everybody else. We're going to make a mistake every once in a while. And if the officers are giving their best, and we're giving them the best equipment, the best tools that they can get, and they're giving their best, if they make an honest mistake, they don't need to be chopped off at the knees. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get off, but we'll be glad to sit down and have those conversations. But I think it's a real need for those conversations, because we got to start talking about disproportionality, and it's not a police problem, it's a societal problem that is putting people in a situation where they're disproportionately impacting the criminal justice system, and then folks are upset with the police because we're doing our job. So I think absolutely we're willing to have that conversation. Let's do it.
Well, I appreciate that, Chief. And if I just might finish my comments, I want to be very clear that most of what I was saying there was not directed at or a critique of you or your department. It's really an ask of concern for management and the mayor and my colleagues to approach these work sessions differently, especially with a topic as sensitive and emotionally charged as this one. And that, thousands and thousands of members of our community have written to us about and demonstrated in the streets about. And those people, again, don't have a consensus about what they want to see happen. I guess, just to bring it back to tasers, which is kind of what the focus of this work session was to try to be, I personally feel like we haven't, I don't feel convinced that tasers are saving lives when we're seeing the data showing that they're going, that use of firearms is continuing to go up. And we've seen deadly use of force incidents involving firearms even while having tasers. And I appreciate the perspective you were bringing. And I just really feel like we need people who are not my non-expert self in here to sort of prevent in a more objective manner what other alternatives could be. So if we're deciding what to invest in moving forward, I'm not convinced that this is the best tool to invest in. But with that, I'm done for tonight. Thank you very much, y'all. And thank you very much, Chief Spruill, for engaging in this conversation, and Captain Harrison for being here and presenting.
Thanks, Jesse. And I'm going to turn to Commissioner Parker before I circle back to Commissioner Link.
I think I will actually choose to direct my comments to the manager after the meeting. So thank you.
Commissioner Link.
Yeah, I just want to point out one related issue that we have not touched on, and that's gun control. being that we live in a country and even more so in a state where any freaking nutbag can get their hands on an automatic weapon and armor-piercing bullets and high-capacity magazines and then chooses to leave them in unlocked trucks, which has happened twice just in the past few years when UGA college students have done this. I understand that every officer enters every tense situation with the presumption that the perpetrator could be armed. I hope, if anything good comes out of the climate that we're in nationally, I hope that it will be a renewed interest in gun control. It certainly didn't take the slaughter of innocent children and worshipers to initiate that conversation. But I do hope that our leaders on a state and a national level, now that they're getting threatened by these people, will see to it that we get this situation under control. We're all at risk. Every person in this nation is at risk, and increasingly people in government are being targeted. And, I empathize with the officers in that respect, in that they face the possibility of armed conflict every single day. And, we're unlike any other nation on earth in allowing this level of access to weapons of war, much less, personal protection.
Thanks, Melissa. Mariah?
All right, yeah. So I got just a couple things to come back around to broader discussion of the use of force in our community. And I just wanted to echo a little bit of what Commissioner Hull and perhaps others before I got here brought up about the need for us to hear from a variety of experts in public safety more expansively defined, in order for us to have like a really in-depth discussion of how we can mitigate use of force in our community by eliminating some of the underlying causes of violent behavior and criminal activity. And so I know, for example, and I believe strongly that those conversations need to be public, because I know, for example, Mayor Gertz, you've expressed that you would be reaching out to representatives of the Albuquerque Public Community Safety Department, folks that have been engaged in some of the policing alternative work that has been done in Eugene, Oregon, and thinking about how we can bring some of their innovations that have been very effective in those communities to Athens. But I think the public could definitely benefit as well from being privy to those conversations that we as a body might have with those entities, or you, Mr. Mayor, get to have with them to, it's educational about what other things we can do to ensure that we don't need to deploy tasers on people. We don't need to, we don't have as many encounters with folks who have weapons in our community to, root out some of the underlying causes of these unfortunate encounters. And so I would love to see those kinds of discussions brought into our work sessions on public safety moving forward. And I guess that's what I'll add to that particular query that you had, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner. Any others before I provide some summary comments? And I'm glad you brought that up, Mariah, because that was actually some of the material that I wanted to discuss in just a couple of minutes. Commissioner Myers.
Yeah, I just have some quick comments here. Some of them are specific to the Axon contract. Others are larger. Just that I echo what Commissioner Parker and Houle said, and I think all that's going on here in terms of having a community conversation, I think that's going to be very hard to have until we get to a place where we can do it in some other forum than online and Zoom and WebEx. And so I look forward to that opportunity. I did want to, in terms of the Axon, and maybe the manager could give me this information later, information on the storage data. This is a huge corporation. There was just something online today about the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration, having a big new, data system with the camcorders from Axon and such. And so I just wanted to know about what was the limitations of the use of our camcorder data by other agencies of the government, if that's included in the contract. I also wanted to know if there were just shorter contracts available. We're talking about 5 years. Was there any discussion of a possibility of a 2 or 3 year contract? Will we have some of these broader discussions? And then the last thing is something I think is really important to bring up that was in the police academy towards the very end, that opened my eyes. Some of those numbers that Chief Spruill and we were looking at in terms of the increase in gun use among officers, or pulling of the guns, and not correlating with the use of, like, you think the use of the tasers would go down. The use of the guns would go down when we had the tasers. And what I kept hearing again was a discussion about an increase in violence in the community, an increase in firearms in the community. And I spoke with one of our Superior Court judges after that presentation I learned from the police academy about this increase in violence. So I think we have to deal with the community that violence that is out there, a lot of it for systemic reasons that we know are way beyond our ability to address completely in this body. At the same time is reimagining policing, security, public safety, and de-escalating things as well. But I would like some more information to us as a body about the increase in violent crimes in the community, and also and how that correlates with gang activity, because that was something I didn't know about at all, and that the judge agreed was not something that was part of a public discussion, and how we are addressing that issue as well. So I'm sure that leads to a lot of violent encounters. Thank you.
Patrick?
I was wrestling with it. Commissioner Myers pretty much said what I wanted. I would like more general information about just crime in general in Athens, not just involving police or police action, just crime in general, because I think that's important to the context of this conversation. But I did have a question to ask Chief Spruill real quick. My District 1 police liaison is Jonathan Patterson. Nice guy. He always emails me and asks me, are there any concerns in District 1 and blah, blah, blah. And I just wonder, does each commissioner get that same type of treatment? And because we used to do town halls where the public, so I remember he's retiring or retired now, Mark Anthony. He would always ask me to do town halls with him, or he would do town halls. But the people in the public would come in and ask questions, and they had issues with tear gassing or issues with tasers. They were privy to. Do you still have that in place, or can you elaborate to the public on that?
Yeah, let me say what you're dealing with as your liaison. Every district has a liaison lieutenant who specifically is assigned to that area, and their requirement is at least once a month. They are required to make contact with the commissioner. They should be making contact with the commissioner, either email or by phone, to check in with them to find out what, if any, issues are going on and how can we engage with the community to work together to develop crime fighting strategies. Beyond that, we have 80 civic associations, business owner associations, homeowners associations, special interest associations that we have officers and supervisors that are assigned there, and they do the same thing. So they are responsible for contacting those specific entities at least once a month to engage with them to find out what, if any, issues are there and how can we work together to develop strategies to address those issues. And so we are, actively now that's been limited. One other part to that is they were required to have at least one physical meeting in those sectors or those districts per month. But with COVID-19, that kind of fell off. And so some of them are doing it digitally, but a lot of places have just stopped meeting. I can tell you that I've had a number of town hall or community meetings even since COVID-19. I was at Ebenezer West. I was at Cornerstone and several other places where I'm still getting out in the community. They're asking questions about the gas incident this summer, tasers, use of force, and all kinds of issues. And so we're out actively involved and engaged and still having those community meetings, even with COVID-19. Mocha Johnson and I did one at Cornerstone Church. We are continuing to try to do that. And the last piece I will say, and I have to fall on my sword, Manager Williams actually asked me here recently he does a monthly manager's update, and he asked me would I give him information about crime data to include in that. So I think his thinking is consistent with what you all's thinking is we want more information about what's going on crime-wise across the city. So we already have that data. I'm going to push it out to him. The other thing I will tell you is, come on a ride along. Please get in the car with the police and come on a ride along. The other thing is we have these trainings that we have available. Come to some of those trainings. And then lastly, we have what's called a strategic response system meeting. It's done electronically by WebEx. We do it every 2 weeks for the captains, and then monthly we do it for each of the lieutenants. And we're reporting out on everything that's going on in those areas, details about crime, quality of life issues, who we're working with, what we're working on, what our priorities are. And I would encourage you, any of you, to sit in on one of those meetings to learn what's going on. I'll try to push that information out to you. All good.
One more thing, can you elaborate on the Jerry Neesmith mental health response team?
Yeah, we just recently we received approval. Thank you to the commission to expand that to a third team. So we already have 2 in place. We have a third team that we are putting in place. They should be in place here shortly. In addition to that, I have made a request through the budget this year for additional teams to try to get 24-hour, 7-day-a-week coverage, or as close to it as we can get with that. And we are looking very hard at this Cahoots program and how they operate to see whether we can, implement some of the things that they're doing there. But we want to expand that program. We think that it would be an excellent thing to expand that program. And we want to look at some of the innovative things that people are doing elsewhere to bring it, to try to see whether we can bring some of that stuff here.
Thanks, Patrick, and thank you, Chief. Any others before I provide some summary comments? All right, well, I want to thank my colleagues here, county commissioners. I think Commissioner Houle noted, we are not living in easy times. And, while certainly we have some benefits of being here in this contemporary moment, we have better access to data than we've had in the past. Historically, we are living in less violent times. We are living in a decade when crime is significantly less than it was in Clarke County in 1990 or 1995 or 2000. We also have greater awareness than we've had, and that consciousness, that awareness has come through in everybody's comments. And so I appreciate everybody being graceful and thoughtful and being willing to ask really difficult questions for which there are not always easy answers, and for which answers are going to continue to reveal themselves as we demand more of ourselves and demand more of staff. And I want to provide great appreciation to Chief Spruill and to you, Captain Daniel, for being here tonight, and to every member of the force. I'll say, having been in public service in education for over 20 years, there were times in my life when I knew that through commission or omission, I failed in my job, or at least provided less than ideal service that had impact on the young people in my charge. And a lot of the police officers I've known, dating back decades to the times when I was in college, put myself through college delivering pizza. And at the first shop I worked in, officers rode along when we were going to be visiting dangerous locations. From then up until this moment that we're sitting here now, a lot of officers I've known entered into policing for the very same reasons I became a teacher, to give of themselves and to see an improvement in their communities. So thank you for all your efforts. I do also want to follow up on some previous conversations. We have, as a body, in our commission retreats and in other ways, looked at how we can be more comprehensive in our view. And even dating back to preparation for the current budget year that we're in, we made some strides in that direction. And so we embedded in the budget a safety and justice coordinator position that can really think holistically and think not just about the justice system in isolation as a silo, but think, what are all those upstream activities, those preventative activities, those community enhancing activities that are going to ensure that we have a safer place for all of us, and that we have a place that's less crime prone. And so in the new year, Manager Williams is going to be advertising for that position. And I'm going to be putting in place an advisory body. I'm just about ready to roll out those individual names. I'm just waiting on a couple more folks. And so I'll name those individuals next week. But for the benefit of the public, the goals of this community advisory body will be to design data-driven, high-yield crime prevention efforts that can be sustained in Athens-Clarke County. And these should include focused efforts regarding housing, education, youth development, employment, hunger prevention, neighborhood enrichment, healthcare, behavioral health supports, and related tactics that are demonstrated to reduce crime. And this work should include both immediate opportunities and long-term commitments on the part of Athens-Clarke County. And this group also should bolster criminal justice system responses that are equitable and supportive of civil rights, human dignity, and recidivism reduction. And this should work to eliminate disparities in system treatment and outcomes by race and ethnicity, should be supportive of individual and community health, should create a continuum of crime and crisis responses that are most appropriate solutions to situations, including a range of professional roles beyond traditional armed responses, and should design ideal training and skill development for public safety officers and enhance graceful returns to the Athens community from those who've served under incarceration or supervision, and that create new opportunities for those individuals. And pertinent to that last element, I will be recommending in the coming fiscal year 2022 budget that we develop a unit that is much in concert with the work that's been done for decades now in Eugene, Oregon through the CAHOOTS program, and has been launched more recently in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So I want the public aware of that work that is ongoing. I think everybody on the call has captured some good elements that we need to launch into our next conversation conscious of, and I'm very much looking forward to that. So I'm going to end my discussion and turn it over to Manager Williams to wrap for the evening.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Commissioners. Chief Sproul, Captain Daniel, I think this was a healthy conversation. We're 2.5 hours in. We've only touched the iceberg of what many of you want to talk about. We've appreciated the feedback that helps to lead into the next work session, and I'll be working with the Chief and Captain Daniel on putting together something that makes sense to progress along those lines. And certainly in the next work session, we won't get through all of it. So it starts the conversation, or continues the conversation, I should say. But I do want to thank all of you for your thoughtful questions. I want to thank our police officers too, and many of you have reflected on how difficult a position they can be in. And it's not just our patrol officers, y'all. It's everybody that serves in public safety in general. I had the honor of knowing a lot of our employees. I can tell you that our officers exhibit the same level of professionalism and dedication that you've seen exhibited tonight by the Chief and the Captain. And I do, many of these folks are residents of Clarke County. You think of a police officer in a uniform, but they also somebody that's at the grocery store, at the ball field. They're fathers and brothers, mothers and sisters, and they have a reverence for life. And they and the same can be said for our community members. I will say, what we have seen this year across the nation, there have been things that are absolutely unacceptable. I will say that our agency for years, and some of you referenced Chief Lumpkin, who really started a different culture and a different approach to community policing. And that spirit is alive today, and I think reflected in the command staff and Chief Sproul and what's happening. But it doesn't mean that we can't be better. And so we want to stand apart from the rest. And I think you will see that our agency has had some tough situations, but we aren't like many agencies across the nation that are scrambling to pull together policies for their interaction with the community. As you'll see, and as we will continue to discuss and answer questions, those things have been in position for a long time, and there's a genuine willingness on behalf of our staff and the community to work together. And I'll echo that sentiment that was expressed tonight by the commissioners. That is the key to moving forward. So thank you, Mayor, for that.
Well, I appreciate members of the community who've joined us digitally tonight. Everybody, please be safe out there. Thanks once again for all your efforts.